Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The storm had rolled in long before the first cracks of thunder split the evening sky, darkening the forest like a thick curtain drawn across the world. The trees groaned and twisted in the wind, their limbs scraping together like the whispers of unseen things in the shadows. The rain came in sheets, heavy and unrelenting, turning the forest floor into a thick soup of mud and fallen leaves. At the center of this vast wilderness stood an old lodge, its windows glowing with the warm, flickering light of a fire inside. It had been abandoned for years, or so the locals thought. Few ventured this deep into the woods, and fewer still dared to stay overnight. But tonight, for reasons unknown, a group of travelers had found their way there. They had stumbled upon the lodge in the midst of the storm, drawn by the dim light that beckoned like a beacon in the darkness. The doors creaked open, and they stepped inside, their footsteps heavy with the dampness of the rain that clung to their boots. The interior of the lodge was just as weathered as the outside, but it held a certain charm, if you could call it that. The walls were lined with dark wood, and the smell of must and old pine filled the air. A large stone fireplace stood at the far end of the room, crackling with the warmth of burning logs. "This place looks well used," remarked one of them, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her name was Lucy. "Are we sure no one's been here recently?" "Not a soul for miles," said her companion, a man named Mark. He was tall, his frame broad, and he had the unmistakable air of someone who thought himself invincible. "Besides, if there's anyone here, they're not gonna mind us staying the night." Lucy frowned, but she didn't argue. There was something about this place, something unsettling. The walls seemed to press in on them, the air too still despite the raging storm outside. Yet, her curiosity won out, and she found herself drawn toward the fire. The rest of the group, 3 others, had already made themselves comfortable around the hearth. A thick rug lay on the wooden floor, and a heavy oak table stood nearby, its surface cluttered with maps, old books, and a forgotten lantern. "I'll go check on the upstairs rooms," said Tom, one of the others, a quiet man with glasses. He was always the first to volunteer for tasks like that. "Good idea," Mark said, tossing a log onto the fire, sending a flare of bright orange light dancing through the room. "We'll need some place to sleep, and if there's anyone else here, I don't want them sneaking up on us." Tom nodded but didn't smile. He walked toward the narrow staircase that led to the second floor, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight as he ascended. His footsteps faded into the sound of the rain, the wind howling louder as it battered the walls. Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the walls. There were strange carvings in the wood, faded symbols that she couldn't quite make out. Her eyes flicked to the old paintings that hung crookedly on the walls, their dark frames cracked with age. The faces in the paintings, none of them seemed quite right. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs, followed by a sharp thud. Everyone jumped, the tension in the room rising immediately. "Tom?" Lucy called out, her voice shaky. No answer. Mark stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket knife he kept on him. "I'll go check it out," he said, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Before he could take a step toward the stairs, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the lodge. Tom appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale and his glasses askew. "Everything all right?" Mark asked, though his voice held a tinge of concern. Tom didn't answer immediately. His gaze seemed distant, unfocused, as though he wasn't seeing them at all. Then, he slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the far corner of the room. Something's down there," he whispered. His voice was trembling, barely audible over the storm. I heard it moving. It's not just the wind." A chill swept over the group. No one moved for a moment, each of them frozen in place as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. Lucy, her heart pounding, was the first to break the silence. "What do you mean, Tom?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's down there?" Tom's lips parted as though he was about to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows of the second floor, his feet dragging as if he couldn't lift them properly. The air grew heavier, thicker, as the group exchanged nervous glances. Mark's hand tightened around the knife's handle. "I'll check it out," he muttered, heading toward the staircase. His voice was more confident now, though there was a tremor in it. "No, I'll go," Lucy said, stepping forward before anyone could protest. There was something about the fear in Tom's eyes that pushed her into motion. "You stay here." The others made no objections. They knew better than to argue with her when she had that look on her face. Lucy crept up the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet on the floor. The door to the second floor creaked open with a sound that echoed through the lodge, setting her nerves on edge. As she stepped inside, the air was cooler, and the faint smell of dust and decay filled her nostrils. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She moved through the dark hallway, her hand tracing the walls as she walked. The wind howled louder outside, and the sound of rain against the windows was deafening. But here, in the silence of the lodge, there was something else. A low hum, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each step she took. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door was slightly ajar. The door that led to a small storage room, a place she hadn't seen when they first entered. She stepped closer, drawn by some unseen force, and pushed the door open with trembling hands. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the faint glow of lightning flashing outside. The air was colder here, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. In the center of the room stood an old wardrobe, its doors cracked open just enough to reveal a dark void inside. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Something stirred inside the wardrobe. A figure. No, not a figure, she realized with a sudden rush of terror. Something was watching her. She didn't wait to see what it was. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her back down the hallway, down the stairs. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the bottom, Mark was already standing at the door, a worried expression on his face. "Lucy?" he asked, his voice urgent. Lucy's heart was hammering in her chest, but she managed to force out the words. "We need to leave. Now." The weight of Lucy's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken fear. Mark blinked, confusion and concern flashing across his face. "Leave? What's going on? What did you see?" Lucy struggled to catch her breath, her hands trembling as she leaned against the doorframe. The storm outside raged on, its fury amplified by the howling wind, but the calm within the lodge felt unnatural now, almost suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone here, that the walls themselves were watching them, waiting. "Something's wrong," she said again, her voice more forceful this time. "I don't know what it is, but we need to leave before—" She cut herself off, unwilling to say the words out loud. The fear was too raw, too close. The others had gathered around the fire, their faces uncertain but mostly calm. Tom, still pale, sat slumped in a chair, his eyes glazed as though he were in a daze. The flames danced before him, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the light didn't seem to reach the dark corners of the room. In those corners, the shadows seemed to grow, lengthening, twisting into shapes that shouldn't have been there. "What happened, Lucy?" Mark repeated, stepping closer. He grabbed her by the shoulders gently, his grip grounding her, pulling her back to the present moment. "Tell me what you saw. Is Tom okay?" Lucy swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't explain it in words, how the darkness inside the lodge felt alive, how the walls seemed to pulse with a quiet, sinister hum. She could still hear that sound from upstairs, that low, almost imperceptible buzzing that had drawn her in. She had felt it, the presence watching her from the shadows, waiting. She had seen something in the wardrobe, a pair of eyes, cold and empty, staring back at her. But she didn't dare say any of that. Not yet. Instead, she nodded at Tom, still staring blankly into the fire. He's not right. He was fine when he went upstairs, but now... She glanced at Mark, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's like he's been changed. And I swear the place up there, it feels wrong. Like it's pulling at you, like it doesn't want you to leave." Mark frowned, looking past Lucy at Tom, who hadn't moved an inch since she'd come down. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his body was rigid, as though frozen in place. The others hadn't noticed anything strange about him, at least not yet, but Mark felt a chill creeping up his spine. Something was off. Something about Tom wasn't quite right. "Maybe he just needs a minute," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned toward the others, signaling them to stay put. "I'll go check on him." But before Mark could make a move, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the lodge. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't thunder. This sound was hollow, like something heavy had been dropped on the floor upstairs. The sound seemed to reverberate through the entire house, vibrating the walls, rattling the windows. Everyone froze. Tom, who had been motionless up until that point, suddenly shifted in his seat. His body jerked, like he was waking from a deep sleep, and his eyes slowly turned toward Mark. The movement was so unnatural, so stiff, that it sent a wave of unease through the group. His gaze was empty, like he wasn't seeing them at all. Mark took a hesitant step toward Tom, but before he could reach him, another loud bang echoed through the lodge, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps overhead. Someone, or something, was moving upstairs. And it wasn't Tom. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she turned to Mark, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave. Now." Mark's expression faltered. He looked toward the others, Jane, the quiet one, and Michael, the most skeptical of the group. They were all staring at him, their eyes wide with fear. They knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't explain it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, turning suffocating, heavy with the unspoken weight of dread. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice firm. "I'll go check it out. Just stay put. And lock the door behind me." Without waiting for an answer, Mark hurried toward the stairs. The storm raged outside, but inside, the lodge was unnervingly silent. The fire crackled, but the heat from it seemed to dissipate as he made his way up, each step creaking beneath his weight. The staircase was narrow, its old wooden railings chipped and worn. But Mark didn't hesitate. As he reached the top of the stairs, the strange hum from earlier returned. The sound seemed louder now, more pronounced. It was coming from the same direction Lucy had pointed to earlier, the storage room, the wardrobe. Mark swallowed, his heart hammering in his chest, but he pressed on. He reached the door to the room, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The room was empty. At least at first glance it appeared so. The wardrobe stood in the center, its doors slightly ajar, just as Lucy had described. The air in the room felt colder, as though it was drawing the warmth from his body, leaving a chill that gnawed at his bones. He approached the wardrobe cautiously, his breath shallow. The humming noise was louder now, vibrating in his chest. He could feel it pressing against him, the weight of it suffocating. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the old wood of the wardrobe. And then, without warning, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mark stumbled back, his heart racing. The sound of the doors had echoed through the lodge like a gunshot, making his pulse spike. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, to get out of the lodge before whatever was inside came for him. But his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, as if something was holding him there, forcing him to stay. The hum grew louder, sharper, until it felt like it was inside his skull, rattling his brain. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure. A shadow. It wasn't human. The figure stood just beyond the wardrobe, its form barely visible in the dim light. Its outline was blurred, shifting as though it wasn't fully solid. Its eyes glowed a faint, sickly yellow, and as Mark stared at it, he felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't look away. The figure moved toward him, its limbs twisted and unnatural, its body contorting with an awful, jerky motion. Mark tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The shadow reached out with its long, bony fingers, its touch cold as ice. And then, a deafening crash echoed through the lodge as the door to the storage room slammed open, knocking Mark off his feet and sending him sprawling to the floor. He turned just in time to see Tom standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body stiff and jerky like a puppet on strings. But Tom wasn't Tom anymore. Whatever was in the lodge, whatever had been waiting for them, had found its new host. The sight of Tom standing in the doorway was more terrifying than any nightmare Mark had ever had. His eyes, those once familiar eyes, were no longer his. They were wide, unblinking, and utterly lifeless, glowing with an unnatural, pale light. His body seemed to move of its own accord, jerking and twitching like a marionette controlled by some unseen force. The air grew colder the longer Mark stared, a bone-chilling frost creeping along the floor and up the walls. For a long moment, the two of them simply stood there, locked in a silent, horrified stare. Then, as if on cue, Tom took a step forward. The sound of his foot hitting the floor was disturbingly slow, deliberate, as though he was testing the space, feeling his way forward like a blind creature. Mark wanted to run, wanted to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. His limbs were frozen, as if bound by invisible ropes, and his heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Tom," Mark whispered, his voice strained, barely a breath. "What happened to you?" There was no answer. The only sound in the room was the relentless pounding of the rain against the roof, the wind howling in fury outside as though it, too, was aware of the horror unfolding within these walls. Tom, no, whatever he had become, took another step forward, his movements still jerky, disjointed. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, that sent a shiver down Mark's spine, Tom spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low, hollow, like a dead man's whisper. Mark's stomach churned. This wasn't Tom. This couldn't be Tom. Whatever had taken hold of him was something far worse. Mark's instincts screamed at him to act, to fight, to run, but he still couldn't move. The figure of Tom, no, the thing that had once been Tom, advanced toward him, its steps slow but gaining in intensity. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with it, the darkness pressing in from all sides. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rasped again, and this time Mark could hear something else beneath the words, the sound of breathing. It was ragged, like the air itself had become too heavy for the thing speaking. The figure stopped a few feet from him, and for a brief moment, Mark saw the faintest glimmer of recognition in the eyes that stared back at him. But that was fleeting, gone in the next instant, replaced by a strange hunger. The hum from the wardrobe was louder now, the air around it vibrating with an energy Mark could feel deep within his bones. It was as though the very walls of the lodge were alive, pulsing with an ancient force that had been waiting for something, or someone, to unlock it. And in that moment, Mark realized with a sickening certainty, the lodge itself wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a place of hunger, and they were all caught in its snare. Tom, or whatever remained of him, began to twitch uncontrollably, his body seizing as though it were struggling against some internal force. His lips parted, but no sound came out, only a deep, guttural growl, low and terrifying, echoing through the room like the growl of some massive, unseen beast. Then, without warning, Tom's body snapped forward with terrifying speed, his hand reaching for Mark's throat. Mark managed to stumble backward just in time, but his foot caught on the floor, sending him sprawling to the ground. He scrambled to push himself up, his hands trembling, the cold sweat of terror slick on his skin. But Tom was already there. The thing that had once been his friend was upon him, its fingers wrapping around Mark's wrist with inhuman strength. There was a moment of resistance, but then the force pulling him forward was too great. He felt the sharp, cold pressure of the thing's grip around his wrist, dragging him closer. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, and with all his might, Mark shoved back, breaking free from Tom's grasp. He scrambled to his feet, panting, heart racing in his chest. He turned to run, but before he could make it more than a few steps, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping him inside. He spun around, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. The thing that had been Tom was standing there again, blocking the only exit. And now, behind it, the wardrobe doors slowly creaked open, the darkness inside swallowing the light of the storm outside. Mark backed away, his mind racing. Think. But there was nothing. No escape. The air was too thick with the presence of something evil, something ancient. He could feel the pressure in his chest as if the walls were closing in on him. And then, from the corner of the room, something else moved. A shadow. It was faint at first, a flicker of movement in the dark, but then it grew, slowly, crawling, slithering across the floor toward him. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He turned to face it, and there, emerging from the darkness beneath the stairs, was another figure. This one was different. Its form was taller, thinner, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long, fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face was shrouded in shadows, but Mark could see the glint of its eyes, pale, milky, and completely devoid of emotion. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Mark realized then that they were surrounded. The walls, the shadows, the very lodge itself, it had chosen them to be its next meal. Help! Mark screamed, though he knew it was pointless. No one could hear him. No one was coming. His mind reeled. Lucy, Michael, Jay. They were still downstairs. They still had a chance to escape. If only he could warn them. But the figures in front of him were already closing in. Tom, or the thing that had been Tom, advanced, the empty eyes locked on Mark with predatory intent. The tall figure from the shadows followed, its movements unervingly smooth like it was gliding. Mark's chest tightened. His thoughts blurred, each one a frantic scream. He couldn't think of a plan, couldn't find a way out. His legs refused to move, frozen in place, and the terror flooded over him like a wave. Just as the first figure lunged forward, its hand reaching for his throat, the storm outside seemed to rise to a deafening roar. And then everything went dark. Lucy had heard the scream. It had torn through the lodge, sharp and desperate, making her blood run cold. It came from upstairs. From Mark. Without a second thought, she bolted toward the stairs, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't think. She just had to get to him. To get out. Mark! She shouted, her voice cracking, but it was drowned out by the storm's fury. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, but inside, the world was eerily silent. Too silent. Her hand gripped the banister as she ascended the stairs, but the moment she stepped onto the second floor, the air felt different. Heavier. Cold, even colder than before. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows too deep. It wasn't just the storm outside. Something had changed in the house. The house was alive and it was hungry. She reached the door to the storage room, the one that had once been closed, the one that now lay ajar. She could feel the heavy presence of something within, something dark and suffocating. The hum, the same low vibration she had heard before, came from within. And then, in the distance, she heard a sound she never thought she'd hear again. Mark's voice, weak, distant, and full of terror. "Lucy," it whispered, barely audible. Her heart leapt in her throat. "Mark," she cried again, her voice louder now, her body shaking with fear. But there was no answer, just that faint, trembling whisper. "Lucy." And then the door to the storage room slammed open. The door to the storage room creaked open with an eerie groan, as though the very hinges had been warped by time and decay. The instant the door moved, a wave of cold air flooded into the hallway, carrying with it a smell of rot, of something ancient and forgotten. Lucy's breath hitched in her throat as she stood frozen at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Her mind screamed for her to turn and run, but her body refused to obey. Mark's voice was barely a whisper now, muffled by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press in on all sides. "Lucy, please, help me." The words sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her, but she couldn't leave him. Not after everything. She couldn't leave him to whatever was lurking in that dark room. Taking a tentative step forward, Lucy crossed the threshold into the cold, dark room. The very air inside felt wrong, like it was alive, and as she moved deeper into the space, her senses became more attuned to the sinister vibrations that filled the lodge. The faint humming she'd felt earlier seemed to be coming from every corner now, resonating in her bones, in her blood, like it was calling to her. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light as she scanned the room, but there was nothing to see. The wardrobe was open, its dark interior like a gaping maw. There was no sign of Mark. No movement. "Mark?" Her voice shook, echoing eerily in the silence. No answer. A heavy dread settled over her as she took another step forward, closer to the wardrobe. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air like a deep, mournful song. She reached for the door of the wardrobe, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the weathered wood. The moment her hand touched it, the hum stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from every direction. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but nothing else. Not a sound. And then, something moved. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was still. Empty. Except for the shadows. The shadows seemed to shift. They were alive. She could feel them crawling along the edges of her vision, slithering across the walls and floor, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucy's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. No, I can't be imagining this. I can't. But it wasn't just in her mind. She could feel it now, the cold, creeping presence pressing against her skin. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They had form, and they were growing. The wardrobe door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, and she screamed. But the scream was swallowed by the dark. Lucy spun around, her eyes wide with terror as the shape of a figure began to materialize from the shadows. It was tall, thin, and unnatural, its form blurring as if it wasn't fully solid. It moved toward her, its limbs bending in ways that were wrong, like a broken puppet. And in the dim light, Lucy saw the eyes. They were milky white, blind, and yet they stared directly at her. They glowed faintly, like pale lanterns in the dark, and there was no warmth in them, no humanity, only hunger. Lucy stumbled backward, her chest tightening as the figure advanced. Her mind screamed for her to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the figure that seemed to come closer with every heartbeat. The figure's lips parted, and a voice, low, guttural, and wrong, whispered her name. "Lucy." It wasn't Mark's voice. It wasn't human at all. It was a rasping sound, like the words were being dragged from the depths of the earth. "Lucy, you shouldn't have come." Lucy took another step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in on her, suffocating her. The figure's hands, no, its claws, reached out, the fingers elongated, twisted, like they had been shaped by something otherworldly. And then she felt it. A cold, icy hand gripped her wrist. She gasped, her eyes wide with horror as the thing's claws dug into her skin, its grip freezing her to the core. The pain was sharp, like ice running through her veins, but it wasn't just physical pain. It was something deeper, something that cut through her very soul. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was too thick. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. It was as though the darkness had consumed her, swallowed her whole, leaving only the cold and the whispering voices. And then, through the overwhelming panic, she heard another voice. It wasn't the thing's voice. It wasn't the shadows. It was Mark. Lucy. It was weak, broken, almost inaudible, but it was enough. With all her strength, Lucy yanked her arm free from the thing's grasp, her body screaming in protest. She turned and ran, the shadows clawing at her heels, the figure still following, but she couldn't stop. She had to get out. She had to find Mark. Bursting out of the storage room, Lucy stumbled down the narrow hallway, her breath ragged as she raced toward the stairs. She could feel the darkness creeping up behind her, following her, its weight pressing against her back. She knew it was too close. She could hear its slow, deliberate steps. She reached the stairs and scrambled down them, nearly tripping on the first step, but she didn't stop. The lodge was silent now, the only sound the pounding of her feet against the wooden floor and the thundering of her heartbeat in her ears. "Mark," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. No response. The only sound was the wind howling outside, louder than ever, as if the storm itself were angry. Lucy reached the bottom of the stairs and skidded into the main room, her eyes searching frantically for any sign of Mark. The others, Michael, Jane, were gone. The room was empty, save for the fire that still flickered weakly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. "Mark," she cried again, her voice trembling with fear. She felt a sharp pang in her chest as she realized, he might not be here. He might not be anywhere. He might. But then, in the far corner of the room, she saw him. Mark. He was standing motionless, his back to her, facing the fire. His head hung low and his body was stiff, like he was made of stone. "Mark?" Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper, her heart aching as she took a cautious step forward. No answer. She moved closer, her feet heavy on the wooden floor. Every instinct in her screamed for her to turn and run, but she couldn't leave him. Not like this. "Mark?" she repeated, her voice more desperate now. Still he didn't respond. But as Lucy reached out to touch his shoulder, his head snapped up. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and they were empty. They glowed, faintly at first, and then brighter, until they burned like pale lanterns in the dark. His mouth opened and a voice, not his, spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was a hollow echo of Tom's words. It was a voice from the deep, dark corners of the world, and it chilled her to the bone. Lucy stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. No, it wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. But it was. "Mark, please no," she whispered, her voice breaking. The thing that wore Mark's face grinned, a twisted, empty smile that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Then it spoke again, the words slow, deliberate, and dripping with malice. "The lodge has claimed you." Lucy's heart hammered painfully in her chest as she stared at the figure that stood before her. It was Mark, in appearance only, his tall frame, his familiar face, the way his hair fell over his forehead. But the eyes, those eyes, were empty, hollow, like dark pools that absorbed all light and hope. They didn't see her. They didn't see anything. They were just empty. Her mind reeled, unable to make sense of the scene in front of her. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his arm, but his skin was cold, unnaturally so, like a corpse. He didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge her touch. "Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking, as if the word itself were a lifeline she was desperate to cling to. "Mark, please, come back." But the thing that wore his face didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, as if it had never seen her before. The smile it gave her, the same smile Mark had once worn so often, was twisted, contorted in a way that made her stomach churn. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rasped, cold and hollow. It wasn't Mark's voice. It was something worse, something darker. "The lodge has claimed you." The words echoed through the room, reverberating in the walls, in her bones. The air itself seemed to grow colder with each passing second, pressing in on her as if the very building was tightening its grip. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered no warmth. It only cast long, dark shadows across the room that seemed to move on their own, shifting, twisting, reaching for her. She tried to move, to step back, but her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor, as if the lodge itself were pulling her into its very foundation. The darkness seemed to follow her, drawing closer with every hesitant step. "Mark, please, if you can hear me, fight it," Lucy cried, her voice trembling with desperation. "You're stronger than this. You're not this thing." The thing that wore Mark's face blinked slowly, its gaze never leaving hers. There was a pause, a moment of silence, before it opened its mouth again, the smile stretching wider, the edges of its lips curling into something far too wide for comfort. "You don't understand," it whispered. "The lodge needs you. It needs us all. It has been waiting for those who are foolish enough to enter, to become part of it, to feed." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just Mark. It wasn't just Tom. It was the lodge itself. The building. The walls. The trees that surrounded it. It was all alive, all connected, all hungry. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She took another step back, but this time her feet didn't move easily. It was as though the floor itself were sticking to her, holding her in place, forcing her to stay. The thing that had once been Mark raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the dark corner of the room. The shadows there seemed to writhe as if they had a mind of their own. And then, with a soft creak, the wardrobe in the corner began to open, just slightly, revealing a deeper darkness inside. "It is waiting," the thing whispered. "It is always waiting." Lucy's blood ran cold. The wardrobe was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a portal, a doorway into something darker, something far older. The hum, the strange vibration she had felt before, it was coming from that place. The shadows that had followed her, the oppressive air, all of it pointed toward that cursed wardrobe. She couldn't let herself go near it. She couldn't. "Mark, no, whatever you are, please," she begged, her voice hoarse with fear. "This isn't you. This isn't you." But the thing only smiled wider, its eyes growing brighter, burning with a sickly yellow glow. Its smile stretched until it looked grotesque, inhuman. The longer it stood there, the more wrong it became. The air in the room thickened, the shadows stretching longer, pulling at her. It opened its mouth again, but this time there was no voice, only a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something starving, something monstrous. The growl seemed to resonate from within the very walls, deep and ancient, as though the lodge itself were alive and hungering for its next victim. With a sudden, terrifying realization, Lucy understood. The thing that had once been Mark, the thing that wore his body, was only the beginning. The lodge had already begun to claim them. It was feeding on them, on their fear, on their very essence. It wanted more. It wanted them to surrender, to become part of it. "Please," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I don't want to die. I can't let this happen." The thing's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "You already belong to it," it whispered. "We all do." And then, before she could even react, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. Lucy spun around, her heart stopping in her chest, but it wasn't the exit, it was the wardrobe. It had opened fully now, and from within it, a deep, inky blackness poured out, swallowing the light from the fire, from the windows. It was like staring into a void that stretched on forever, a place where time and space didn't exist, a place where only darkness reigned. A deep, unsettling whisper rose from the depths of the wardrobe. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a feeling, a pull, a force that seemed to claw at her very soul. The thing, Mark or whatever it was, stepped back, its head tilting again as if it were watching a piece of prey try to escape. "It's here. It's coming for you now." The shadows in the room began to shift, closing in on her. They were moving, slithering across the floor like snakes, their edges sharp, their forms shifting like smoke. They stretched out toward her, reaching for her, pulling at her legs, her arms. "No!" she cried, her voice cracking as she tried to pull away. But the shadows held her fast, pulling her toward the wardrobe. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it drowned out all other sound. She fought, she pulled, but the darkness was too strong. Her mind screamed for her to get away, to break free. But no matter how hard she struggled, no matter how fiercely she fought, the darkness kept pulling her in. Her breath quickened, her eyes wild with panic, and then, with one final, desperate cry, she lunged forward, throwing herself toward the door, toward the only thing that might give her a chance of escape. But the shadows followed her. They engulfed her. And then the world went dark. Lucy woke to darkness, but not the suffocating blackness of the lodge. It was different, deeper. A sense of emptiness pervaded the space around her. She felt weightless, suspended in an ocean of shadow. Her body felt numb, as though she were submerged in cold water, unable to move. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. But there was something else, something deeper within her, tugging at her mind, a call, a beckoning. The silence was deafening. Was this it? She thought. Was this how it ends? But then, like a soft whisper from the depths, she heard it. A voice. But not a voice, not really. The lodge. The voice, if it could even be called a voice, came from everywhere, a soft, insidious hum that filled the space around her. It wasn't something she could hear with her ears, but something she could feel deep within her chest, in the marrow of her bones. It was an invitation, an offering, a dark pull that seemed to sink into her very soul, dragging her down deeper into the unknown. "You're mine now." The words reverberated through her mind, but they didn't sound like words at all. They were more like thoughts, invasive, foreign, and yet familiar. Like they had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. Her breath quickened, but there was no air, no lungs to fill. It was as though she existed in the space between breaths, in a void where the rules of reality no longer applied. Her mind fought to comprehend what was happening, but every time she tried to focus, her thoughts were swallowed by the overwhelming presence that surrounded her. And then, just when she thought she might lose herself completely to the darkness, a shape appeared in the distance, a faint flicker of movement that tugged at her awareness. It was hazy at first, indistinct, but it grew clearer the longer she focused on it. It was a figure, a silhouette that seemed to materialize from the blackness, taking form like smoke, its edges rippling and shifting with the slow grace of something ancient. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. It was Mark. Or at least, it was a shape that resembled him, his outline, his height, his features. But there was no mistaking the emptiness in the eyes, that hollow, void-like stare that she had seen earlier, the thing that wore Mark's face. It drifted closer, its form flickering in and out of existence, like it was caught between this world and the one beyond. The shadows around it stretched and bent, feeding off the darkness that had swallowed her. It was as if the thing itself was made of that darkness, shaped by it, fueled by it. Lucy tried to speak, to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The emptiness in her chest pressed against her, suffocating her, filling her with dread. And then it spoke. The same cold, rasping voice she had heard before. "You are mine now, Lucy," it said, the words winding around her like a cold, invisible rope. "You belong to the lodge. We all do. We've been waiting for you." The words were more than just spoken. They were felt in the very core of her being, sinking into her bones, into her blood. It was as though her body had become a vessel for something ancient and terrible, something that wanted to fill her completely, consume her. "No," she whispered, but even her own voice seemed distant, like it wasn't truly hers. "This isn't me. This isn't Mark." The figure didn't answer. Instead, it simply stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. With each step it took, the shadows in the distance seemed to ripple and shift, as though the lodge itself was alive, responding to the presence of the figure, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Lucy felt her body being drawn toward it, against her will. The darkness was everywhere now, crawling along her skin, thick and oppressive. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air had become stifling, suffocating, pressing against her with the weight of 1,000 forgotten years. The figure reached out toward her, its hand stretched in front of it. Lucy recoiled instinctively, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. The pull was too great. It was like trying to fight the ocean, to keep herself afloat when the tide had already pulled her under. The thing that wore Mark's face reached for her, and as its fingers brushed against her skin, she felt a cold, sharp sting, like ice being driven into her veins. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like her very essence was being torn from her, piece by piece. She gasped in shock, but no sound came out. There was no air to gasp for. Only cold, only the darkness. "You're part of it now," the figure whispered, its voice low and unfeeling. "Part of the hunger. Part of the lodge." The words reverberated in her mind, growing louder, more insistent. And with each passing second, the shadows seemed to grow, folding in on themselves, twisting into new shapes, new forms. They pressed in on her from all sides, clawing, scraping, aching to take her, to claim her, to feed on her fear. But it wasn't just fear. It wasn't just the terror that rippled through her skin. It was more. It was her life, her very soul. The lodge didn't just want her fear, it wanted everything. Her thoughts, her memories, her essence. It wanted to consume her. Lucy felt herself being pulled forward, as if an invisible thread was tied around her chest, tugging her toward the darkness. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but it was no use. Her body was no longer her own. Then, suddenly, a voice broke through the oppressive silence. A voice that was not the thing that wore Mark's face. It was familiar. It was her voice. "Lucy." It was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough to cut through the darkness. "Lucy, please?" She turned toward the sound of the voice, but there was nothing there. No figure. No shape. Only the shadows, the deep, swirling blackness that seemed to consume everything it touched. But then she saw it. A flicker. A faint glimmer of light. It was Mark. Her Mark. He stood at the edge of the dark void, his hand outstretched toward her, his face twisted in pain, his eyes pleading with her. "Mark," she cried, her voice breaking through the silence. "Please come back to me." The shadows stirred around him, reaching for him, but he didn't pull away. His expression was torn, anguished. He was there, but not. He was being pulled toward the darkness, just as she was. "I'm sorry." His voice was barely audible, the words trembling with guilt. I can't stop it. It's too powerful, Lucy. The lodge, it has us all." Lucy's heart shattered at the sound of his voice. It was broken. He was broken. She reached out toward him, her fingers aching to touch him, but no matter how much she tried to move, the darkness wouldn't let her. The shadows clung to her like wet cloth, suffocating her, pulling her further from him. "Mark, please," she cried, her voice raw. "I won't leave you. I won't leave you here." But even as she spoke, she knew, deep down, that there was no way out. Not for her. Not for him. Not for any of them. The lodge had already claimed them, and there was no escape. The figure that wore Mark's face moved toward her again, its cold, dead eyes fixed on her. The shadows swirled around it, as if responding to its presence. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, thicker, suffocating her. "It's too late," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You're mine. We all are." The last shred of resistance broke within her, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the world was closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, until there was nothing left but the cold, empty blackness. And then, just as everything seemed to fade away, the voice whispered again, softer now, almost tender. "You are part of the lodge, Lucy. Welcome home." Lucy opened her eyes. But there was no sky, no stars, no world above her, below her. She was suspended in darkness, weightless and cold, drifting through a space that had no beginning and no end. Her breath, though she could feel it in her chest, didn't escape her lips. The air was heavy, dense, and yet it was not air. It was something else, something she could not comprehend. And then she saw them. Shapes, shifting, moving. More figures, like shadows, like the things she had seen before. Faces. Mark's face. Tom. The others, Jane, Michael, they were all there, but they were not there. They were trapped. But so was she. The lodge had claimed them all. Lucy's heart thudded in her chest, but it was no use. She was weightless, suspended in a void where nothing existed but darkness, emptiness, and the oppressive weight of hunger. A hunger that didn't feel like it came from her stomach, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere more primal, more essential. It was a gnawing, relentless craving, like the very fibers of her being were being stretched thin and torn apart by something she could not see, could not name. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. But she felt. She sensed everything. Every flicker of thought, every pang of emotion, every ripple of fear, as though they were not her own but somehow part of something far larger, something far more ancient. And then the voices came. They were soft at first, whispers on the edges of her consciousness, too faint to make out. But as they grew louder, they became clearer, horrible, anguished, hungry voices. The voices of those who had come before her, who had been drawn to the lodge and consumed by its insatiable hunger. "Help me," a voice echoed. "Please, it's cold, it's so cold." Lucy froze, the chill of dread sinking into her bones as she realized it wasn't just her. She wasn't alone in the void. The shadows, the faces, the coldness, they were all here. And they were not waiting to take her. No, they had already taken her. She had already been consumed. "Help me, Lucy." The voice was familiar. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. Mark? Her own voice was shaky, but it cut through the void. Her mind was reeling, the pieces clicking into place. The voice, Mark's voice, was distant, warped, like a reflection twisted in a broken mirror. But she wasn't alone in this void. She couldn't be alone. She wouldn't be. Not when Mark needed her. She reached out, desperate for the voice, desperate for the faintest trace of the person she loved. "Mark, please?" She called again, but there was no answer. The darkness shifted around her. The air was thick with an oppressive force, like something large and looming, something alive. She couldn't feel the pull of gravity, but she could sense that she was being drawn toward something. Something deeper, darker, more suffocating. The hunger inside her twisted. The air thickened with the whispers. "You're mine now." The voice, Mark's voice, or what had once been his, whispered again, but now it was cold, almost mocking. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't him. It wasn't Mark. Not anymore. The darkness around her expanded, pushing forward like a tidal wave, and with it came more whispers, more voices, more faces. Lucy screamed, but no sound escaped her. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was no place to hide. No walls to shield her. No light to guide her. "I am here," a voice seemed to say. "You will always be here." The shadows stretched and swirled around her like a living thing. As they shifted, shapes began to form, figures emerging from the darkness like ragged remnants of lost souls. The more they moved, the more she recognized them. They were the ones who had come before her. The ones who had already been consumed by the lodge. Each figure was twisted, changed. Their faces were pale and blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, fixed with that same hollow stare she had seen in Mark's face, dead, empty, and hungry. She tried to push them away, tried to fight the cold, the hunger gnawing at her, but she was already becoming part of them. The more she fought, the more she felt herself slipping away, her thoughts growing hazy like she was drowning in the darkness. But the harder she fought, the more it called to her. The hunger intensified, filling her chest, her throat, her veins. It was as though she were starving from the inside out, her body and soul both withering under the weight of the hunger. A face pressed close to hers, a familiar one, was Tom. His eyes were wide open, but they were unseeing. His lips were cracked and dry, like he hadn't spoken in years. He reached out to touch her, but his fingers were no longer human. They were jagged, twisted, like claws. "You're mine," he rasped. "We are all the lodges now." Lucy recoiled, but there was no escaping the grip of the shadows. No escaping the force that had already claimed her. The edges of her vision blurred, and for a moment she lost herself. She couldn't remember who she was anymore. She didn't remember Mark. She didn't remember the world outside the darkness. All that remained was the endless hunger, the insatiable, gnawing hunger that consumed everything, devoured everything, until nothing was left but emptiness. And then, somewhere in the distance, she felt something, or someone, pulling her back. A flicker of light. A memory. "Mark," she whispered, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Mark, where are you?" The darkness didn't answer. But then a sudden warmth, a brief warmth like the touch of sunlight on her skin, pierced through the suffocating cold. She didn't know where it came from, but it was a light, a spark, deep within the void. It wasn't much, but it was enough to feel something beyond the hunger. Mark. She could see him now, see his face, distorted and blurred, floating just beyond her reach. He was there, but not. His form flickered, like a candle struggling against the wind. And in that moment, she realized something that made her stomach twist with despair. Mark wasn't just lost in the darkness. He was part of it now. He was already consumed by it, but she couldn't leave him. She couldn't let him go. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. "Mark," she whispered again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She reached out toward him, but the shadows clung to her like chains, holding her back. With all her strength, she pushed against them, trying to move toward the flickering image of his face. And then, just as her fingertips brushed the edges of the darkness, everything shifted. The lodge. She felt it again, like a tremor beneath her feet, like a pulse of ancient, unyielding power. It moved, breathed, and consumed, expanding and contracting like a living organism. She felt the tug of its hunger, its need for her, for everyone. It wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was everywhere. The very fabric of the void was intertwined with the lodge itself, and it was pulling her in deeper. The hunger wanted her. But something else rose inside her. A spark. A stubborn, defiant flicker of life. She was not ready to let go. Not yet. "I'm not yours," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the swelling noise of the darkness. "I'm not yours." With everything she had left, Lucy forced herself toward the flickering image of Mark. She could feel the cold grasp of the shadows tightening around her, but she fought. She pulled herself closer. There was something she could still do. She would fight for him. Fight for them both. And then, the walls shattered. For the briefest of moments, the void opened. The darkness ripped apart, the pressure lifted, and the sensation of being, of existing, returned to her. But it wasn't just the return of sensation. It was the return of herself. She was no longer just a prisoner of the lodge. She was its enemy. And in the distance, just beyond the breaking dark, she saw him. Mark. This time, his face was clear. His eyes were no longer empty. His hands reached toward her, and for the first time since the moment they had arrived, she saw something real. Something alive. It wasn't too late. "Mark," Lucy's voice broke, raw with emotion. He smiled. But there was a twist to it, a shadow in his eyes. And then, in a voice that was no longer his own, that was a part of the lodge's infinite hunger, he said, "Welcome home." Lucy's heart raced, a whirlwind of emotions flooding through her. Mark's face was so familiar, so real, yet there was something wrong about him. Something deeper, more insidious, that twisted his expression into something barely recognizable. The shadow of the lodge had marked him, and it had claimed him, just as it had claimed everything else. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything other than what she was doing, which was reaching out toward the flickering figure of the man she loved. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened to him, what had happened to them all. The darkness churned beneath her feet, its pulse beating in time with her own. The hunger was not just a physical thing, it was more than that. It was a hunger for everything. A hunger that stretched across time, space, and souls. And it wanted her. It wanted Mark. It wanted all of them. But it was different now. The hunger felt more present, more alive, as if it could hear her thoughts, her fears. The more she reached for Mark, the more she felt it tightening around her, pulling at her from every direction. The darkness wasn't just around her, it was inside her. She had already been touched by it, already marked by its cold fingers. And now it was coming for her, for them both. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But her breath hitched as she realized, the voice she had heard was not his. The figure that stood before her flickered, like an image on a dying screen, distorting and shifting with every heartbeat. Mark's body, once so strong, so vibrant, had become a mere vessel, a hollow shell. The air around him thickened with the scent of decay, and the deep, mournful hum of the lodge echoed louder in her ears. "I've been waiting for you," the figure spoke again, its voice like 1,000 souls whispering at once. It wasn't Mark's voice, not anymore. It was a collective, a chorus of the lost, the consumed. "You're part of it now. You always have been." Her blood ran cold as the figure reached out, its fingers elongating, twisting into grotesque shapes that were no longer human. It wasn't Mark, not in any sense of the word. The hollow gaze, the cold smile, it was all part of the lodge's cruel game. "No!" she screamed, her hands instinctively recoiling, trying to block out the horror before her. But there was no escape. The shadows stretched longer, reaching for her, pulling her into their cold embrace. The more she struggled, the tighter the lodge's grip became. "It was always meant to be like this," the figure continued, its voice rising into a cacophony, its words like a symphony of agony. "The lodge waits for those who come. It chooses them. They belong to it. You belong to it." The darkness swirled around her, constricting like a tightening noose. The lodge's presence was everywhere now, beneath her skin, inside her head, in the air she breathed. It was the air. It was everything. Lucy gasped for breath, but it was like trying to inhale water. The more she tried to fight, the harder it became to breathe, to think. Her thoughts were slipping away, consumed by the darkness. But just as her mind began to shatter under the weight of the hunger, she heard something else. A voice, small but clear, cutting through the din. "Lucy." It was Mark's voice. Her heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. For a moment, she wasn't sure if it was real or just another trick of the darkness. But then she saw it, a brief flicker of light in the vast, consuming void. The face of Mark appeared again, this time clear and untainted. His expression was filled with pain and fear. "Mark," Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. "Where are you?" His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was no shadow, no hunger, just the man she had loved. But that fleeting image was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed up by the swirling blackness. "You can't fight it, Lucy," the figure, Mark, said, its voice twisted. "It's too late." Lucy's stomach churned, her mind screaming for a way out, but the darkness was too thick, too consuming. The figure before her was no longer a man, no longer Mark, but a thing, a shadow wrapped in flesh, a hollow, empty vessel. But even as the lodge clawed at her, even as it pulled her in, a spark of defiance lit in her chest. "No," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "I'm not yours. I will never be yours." The darkness recoiled as if taken aback by her words. It faltered for just a moment, and in that brief instant Lucy felt something shift in the void. The hunger, which had seemed all-consuming, faltered. She reached out, this time with more force, more determination than she had ever known. Her fingers trembled, but she reached for Mark. And then it happened. The darkness screamed. It wasn't a sound, no. It was more than that. It was a sensation, a pressure that squeezed every thought, every memory, every feeling out of her. The very essence of the lodge recoiled from her, as though it couldn't bear the light of her defiance. Mark's face flickered again, but this time it wasn't hollow. It wasn't twisted. His eyes were human again, bright, full of life. "Fight it," Mark's voice, his true voice, spoke clear and steady. "Lucy, don't give in. Don't let it consume you." Her heart surged with a fierce hope, and for the first time since the lodge had taken her, she felt a sliver of control. The hunger was still there, still clawing at her, but now she saw it for what it was: weakness. The lodge's power was fading. It was only feeding on her fear, on her weakness. Mark's figure was still fading, slipping back into the darkness, but his voice remained. "You have to choose, Lucy." His voice trembled, but there was strength in it. "You can't stay here. You have to leave." The darkness around her writhed, but she stood firm. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for Mark, fighting for them all. She refused to let the lodge win. The shadows recoiled again, thrashing violently in all directions, as if they were being torn apart by an unseen force. Lucy felt herself being pulled in every direction, the lodge fighting for control, but she clung to the light of Mark's voice. "I love you, Lucy," Mark's voice echoed, barely audible beneath the roar of the darkness. "I will always love you. But you have to fight. You have to let go." Her vision blurred as tears flooded her eyes. She felt the presence of the lodge, the pull of its insatiable hunger, gripping at her. But her heart burned with something more, something stronger. "I will fight," Lucy whispered to herself, to Mark, to the lodge. "I will never let you win." And then, as if the words themselves were a barrier, the darkness shattered. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single violent crack. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing tear, as though the very fabric of reality was being ripped apart, piece by piece. The darkness that had consumed her, that had held her in its suffocating grip, began to unravel. It was like watching the threads of a dream dissolve into nothingness. The weight lifted from her chest. She gasped, actually gasped, for breath. Real air filled her lungs, clean and cool, like a rush of fresh wind after a storm. The shadows receded, twisting and dissipating into nothingness. Mark's face flickered before her once more, but this time, it was his true face. His eyes were clear, filled with warmth and love. He reached out to her, but this time there was no hunger, no pull. The lodge's grip was weakening. "We're getting out of here," Lucy said, her voice full of determination. She reached out toward Mark, her hand trembling but strong. "Together," Mark whispered as his form stabilized in front of her. But even as the darkness began to fade, Lucy knew the lodge was not gone. It never would be. It had tasted their souls. It had touched them all. It knew them. And it would always be there. But for now they were free. Together. And that was enough. Lucy's eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she noticed was the light. The soft, muted glow of dawn spilling through the trees, casting gentle golden rays that flickered through the canopy above. The forest was calm again, quiet, still. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, and with it, the suffocating presence of the lodge. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe. She slowly sat up, her body aching from the strain, her mind still reeling from what had happened, from everything she had witnessed, felt, and experienced. The journey to escape had been long, brutal, and terrifying. She wasn't sure if the darkness had truly left her, or if it would always linger like an echo. But for now she was free. The air smelled fresh, damp, earthy, the scent of moss and pine. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds were the only sounds that filled the air. Lucy's gaze flickered over the forest around her, the trees towering high above. Everything looked normal, so quiet, so peaceful. But she knew better now. She knew what the woods could hide. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He was beside her, lying on the forest floor, still ashen and bruised from their ordeal, but his chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of steady breaths. His features were peaceful, almost serene in contrast to the twisted figure he had become in the darkness. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against his, feeling the warmth of his skin, a sign that he was still there, still with her. "Mark?" she repeated, her voice a little louder now. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering as his hand gripped hers tighter. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the soft light of morning. For a moment, his gaze was unfocused, distant, like someone waking from a dream they couldn't fully remember. But then, as his eyes cleared, he looked at her, and Lucy felt a surge of relief flood through her. "Lucy?" His voice was hoarse, cracked, as though he hadn't spoken in days. Are we out?" Tears welled in Lucy's eyes and she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around him tightly. She hadn't realized just how much she had needed to feel him again, how much she had missed the warmth of his embrace, the safety of his touch. "We're out, Mark," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're out of that hell." Mark exhaled, his breath shaky as he hugged her back, as though unsure whether this moment was real or not. He pulled away just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with trembling fingers. I thought I lost you," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I thought the lodge had already claimed you. I couldn't." He stopped, choking on his words. "I couldn't let it take you." Lucy touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, still amazed that he was there, that he was real. His warmth was the most comforting thing she had ever felt. "You didn't lose me, Mark," she said softly. "We both fought. We're still here." There was a long silence between them, one filled with a strange, fragile peace. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. "Do you think it's really over?" Mark asked after a moment, his voice quiet, as though afraid the answer would shatter everything they had just regained. Lucy hesitated, looking around the forest. She didn't know. She couldn't be sure. The woods were calm, but she had learned to never take anything at face value here. The lodge had a way of clinging to its victims, a way of reaching into the very heart of those it touched. The darkness that had consumed them, that had nearly broken them both, was not something that could be easily banished. It was more than just a force. It was a presence, an ancient thing that waited, watching, always ready to return. "I don't know," she said slowly, "but I'm not giving up. We won't let it take us again." She felt Mark nod, his forehead resting against hers as they sat in the quiet forest, surrounded by the weight of their shared experience. The pain of everything that had happened was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but so was something else, something stronger. A bond forged in the darkness, in the horrors they had survived. And it was that bond, their bond, that would keep them together, keep them strong. "We'll rebuild," Mark said softly, pulling her back into his arms. "We'll find a way to move forward no matter what." Lucy closed her eyes, letting the moment sink in. For the first time since their arrival in the lodge, she felt the slightest flicker of hope. A tiny spark in the midst of everything. The forest seemed to breathe with them. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. The trees, though ancient, didn't feel like looming giants anymore. They felt like protectors. The birds sang softly in the distance, the wind rustling gently through the leaves. But then something caught her eye. A movement, a flicker of shadow just beyond the trees. Her heart skipped a beat, her body instinctively tensing. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice low, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the trees. Mark stiffened beside her. His eyes darted toward the movement, but he didn't say anything, his face unreadable. They both watched in silence, waiting, unsure if their eyes were playing tricks on them or if something else, something darker, was lurking just out of sight. A figure stepped out from the trees. It was a person, or at least it appeared to be. A man, tall and thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothing. His face was obscured by the shadows of the forest, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. "Who are you?" Mark called, his voice steady but wary. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate. His face remained hidden in shadow, but as he drew closer, Lucy felt a chill creep up her spine. There was something unsettling about him, something unnatural, like he didn't belong here, not in the world they had just fought so hard to escape. The man stopped just a few feet away, his figure emerging fully from the dark trees. "You escaped," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "The lodge, it's not done with you." The words hit Lucy like a slap to the face. The air around them seemed to grow heavier again, as though the shadows had returned with this strange figure, pressing in on them. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're free. We escaped. You don't understand. It can't have us anymore." The man's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "You think it's that simple?" Lucy felt a shiver run through her, deep and cold. There was something in his eyes, something that suggested he knew more about the lodge than anyone should. His presence was like a spark to dry tinder, setting her nerves on fire with dread. "I was just like you," he said quietly. "I thought I could escape too. But the lodge never lets go. You'll see. It will always find you." Mark stood up slowly, placing himself between Lucy and the stranger. His stance was protective, defensive, as though ready to fight if necessary. "Who are you?" Mark demanded. "What do you want?" The stranger looked at Mark, his eyes briefly flicking over him as though appraising him. He tilted his head slightly as if amused by Mark's question. "I'm just a messenger," he said softly. "But you'll find out soon enough. You can't run from it. You can't hide." Mark stepped forward, but the man held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't say I didn't warn you," the man said, his voice growing colder, more distant. Then, without another word, the figure turned and disappeared back into the trees, melting into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. Lucy and Mark stood in stunned silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest was still. The birds resumed their songs, the wind rustling through the trees. But the unease lingered. The stranger's words echoed in Lucy's mind, reverberating through the fragile peace she had begun to build. They weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. The darkness, the hunger, the lodge, it wasn't over. Not yet. But they had each other. And together they would face whatever was coming next. The air had grown thick again, heavy with a sense of something unsaid, something just beyond their reach. The forest around them seemed quieter now, more oppressive, the very trees towering like silent sentinels, watching them with unseen eyes. The strange man, the messenger, had vanished without a trace, but his words lingered like a fog, pressing on Lucy's mind. You can't run from it. You can't hide. What did that mean? Had they really escaped the lodge? Was it just waiting for them to slip up, to falter, to become weak again? Could they really be free? Lucy glanced at Mark, who stood beside her, his eyes focused on the trees, his body rigid, every muscle tense. She could see the same doubt in his eyes, the same confusion. He had heard the man's warning too. They both knew deep down that this wasn't the end. The forest was still alive with secrets, still steeped in something darker than they could understand. Mark turned to her, his face weary but resolute. "We'll figure it out, Lucy," he said quietly. "We've come this far. We'll keep going. We won't let it take us." Lucy nodded, but there was an unease in her chest, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. How could they fight something they couldn't even fully comprehend? How could they survive when the very world around them seemed to breathe with a hunger that could never be satisfied? As if the forest itself had heard her thoughts, a cold wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves with a whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. She knew it wasn't the wind, it was something else, something watching. She could feel it like a pressure on the back of her neck, as if something was waiting to pounce. Without warning, a low growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't an animal's growl. It wasn't the sound of a wolf or bear. This growl was deeper, darker, more primal. It felt like it was coming from the very ground beneath their feet, from the trees themselves. It resonated in Lucy's bones, sending a wave of fear crashing through her. Mark's hand instinctively reached for hers, gripping it tightly. "Stay close," he murmured. Lucy nodded, her heart racing. She had no idea what was out there in the forest, but the growl was a warning, and they were in no position to ignore it. The trees shifted again, the wind swirling faster now, making the forest around them feel even more alive, more suffocating. The shadows grew longer, twisting and writhing as though they had a life of their own. Lucy felt the pull of the darkness again, that familiar tug deep in her chest, like it was calling her back. But this time she wasn't going to fall into its trap. She couldn't. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't need any more encouragement. They turned and began walking through the dense underbrush, their feet crunching against the dry leaves and twigs, the forest seeming to close in around them with every step. Every now and then, Lucy would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shape of the dark figure that had warned them, or something worse, something more horrifying than they had ever seen before. But there was nothing, just the shadows. The growl echoed again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was right behind them, like a predator stalking its prey, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Mark?" Lucy breathed, her voice trembling. "What is that?" "I don't know," Mark answered, his jaw clenched. "But it's not good." They pushed forward, their pace quickening as the forest seemed to close in around them. The growl came again, followed by a strange, guttural sound, like something scraping against the trees, something far larger than any creature they had ever encountered. The ground beneath their feet trembled. And then, through the trees ahead, Lucy saw it. The shape. It was large, too large for anything natural. A hulking figure, its body covered in a layer of dark fur, its eyes glowing an eerie green in the dim light. It had the body of an animal, but the face was wrong. It was twisted, deformed, with sharp, jagged teeth jutting from its gaping mouth. Its eyes were filled with malice, and its growl vibrated through the very earth beneath them. The creature stepped forward, and Lucy's blood ran cold. It was no animal. It was something worse. Something born of the forest's darkest, deepest secrets. Mark, Lucy gasped, her voice barely audible. What is that thing? Mark didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes wide with horror. He was frozen, staring at the creature, the same realization dawning on him that had just hit Lucy. It was the lodge. The lodge had created this. It was the darkness made flesh. It was the hunger that had once stalked them from within the forest, now manifested into a monstrous form. And it was coming for them. Run! Mark shouted, his voice breaking the silence. Without thinking, Lucy grabbed his hand and they bolted into the trees, crashing through the underbrush, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the creature's growl echoed through the forest, its massive paws pounding against the ground, gaining on them. The trees blurred past them, the sounds of the forest drowned out by the thundering footsteps of the beast. Lucy felt its presence behind them, like a shadow stretching over them, growing longer, closer with every passing second. She could hear its breath, deep and heavy, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it reached them. "We're not going to outrun it," she shouted, her voice full of panic. "We have to find a way." Mark yelled back, his face grim. "Keep moving." They burst through a thicket and found themselves at the edge of a small clearing. Lucy's heart skipped a beat when she saw what lay ahead. A cabin. It wasn't much, just a ramshackle building that seemed as though it had been abandoned for years. Its walls were weathered, the windows shattered, and the door hanging off its hinges. But it was a shelter. A place to hide, at least for a moment. Inside, Mark shouted, already heading for the cabin. They ran toward it, Lucy's feet slipping on the damp ground, the fear driving her forward. The creature's growls were louder now, closer, and she could feel its breath on the back of her neck. They reached the cabin, and without hesitating, Mark shoved the door open, pulling her inside with him. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Lucy turned, her eyes wide, searching the room for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. The air was musty and stale, and the floor creaked under their feet. "We're safe," Mark breathed, but his voice was filled with uncertainty. They both stood there for a moment, gasping for air, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. But Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, like something was watching, waiting. A low, guttural sound filled the air. It wasn't the creature outside. It was something else. Something closer. Mark turned to face her, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Lucy nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from inside the cabin. Mark stepped forward cautiously, his hand reaching for the old, rusted knife that hung from his belt. "Stay close," he whispered. Lucy nodded, stepping up beside him, but as she did, she saw something move in the corner of the room. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure. A person. It was tall, thin, dressed in ragged clothes, and standing motionless in the corner, just barely visible in the darkness. The figure turned slowly to face them, and Lucy's blood ran cold. It was the same man. The messenger. But now, his face was twisted, contorted, like it had been pulled out of shape. His eyes were hollow, darkened, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice cold and empty. "It's never over." Lucy's pulse raced. The figure in the corner was no longer just a messenger, it was something far worse. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around them. She could feel the weight of the air pressing on her chest, and she knew the lodge hadn't let go. It never would. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark stood still, his grip tightening on the knife in his hand, his eyes locked on the figure. "Stay behind me," he muttered. The figure tilted its head as if amused. "You think you can fight it?" he asked, his voice colder than before. "You think you can fight the lodge?" Lucy's hands shook, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure's presence filled the room, suffocating them both. His hollow eyes seemed to see them, see into them beyond their physical forms, to the very essence of who they were, what they had endured. The message he carried was clear, yet terrifying. There was no escape from the lodge. They had merely scratched the surface of a deeper, far darker truth. Lucy could feel it now, the pull of something vast, ancient, waiting beneath the cabin, beneath the earth. It wasn't just the creature outside, it was the land itself, as if the very soil were hungry, yearning for something, them. The figure in the corner took a slow, deliberate step toward them. Each movement was unnervingly calm, as though time itself had slowed, stretching the moment thin, taut with impending dread. "You'll never be free," he whispered, his voice a low rasp. "You cannot outrun what is in your blood." "Who are you?" Mark's voice was strained, his grip on the knife tightening as if it might be the only thing keeping him grounded in this nightmare. The figure's lips curled into an unnervingly calm smile. "I am a part of what you fled. A part of the forest's hunger. The lodge's hunger. It has always been inside you, inside the both of you. And now, it's time to finish what was started." Lucy's pulse raced. She stepped back, her feet scraping against the wooden floorboards, as if she could flee from the truth itself. "No, this can't be real." The figure's laugh was hollow, echoing off the cabin walls like a mocking echo of their fears. "It is real, Lucy. It has always been real." Mark advanced cautiously, stepping between her and the figure. His breath came in shallow gasps. "You're lying. We beat it. We broke free. You're not real." His voice wavered slightly as if he himself wasn't sure. The figure didn't flinch. "I was once like you. One of those who thought they could leave. Thought they could escape the pull. But you can't. You won't." Lucy felt the temperature in the room drop, the air thickening. The corners of her vision began to blur. Was it her eyes, or was the cabin itself warping? The walls felt as if they were closing in, pressing down from every side. Suddenly, a deafening thud reverberated from the earth beneath their feet. The whole cabin shook. The lights flickered. The growls of the creature outside grew louder, sharper, more frantic. "No," Mark whispered. "We've got to go. We can't stay here." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She turned to Mark, but her eyes were drawn back to the figure, who now took another step forward, closer, filling the space between them like a shadow that stretched and coiled. The figure's smile widened. "You cannot escape what is already within you." "Mark," Lucy whispered, barely able to breathe through the rising dread. "I don't think we can run anymore." The figure's eyes glinted, predatory. "Exactly." The words slid out like silk over broken glass. "You're not meant to run. Not anymore. You were brought here for a reason. And once the lodge has claimed you, you belong to it no matter where you go." The floorboards beneath them groaned again, a deep, guttural creak that resonated in the pit of Lucy's stomach. Something was rising, something ancient and hungry, just beneath the surface. "I won't let it take me," Lucy snapped, her voice full of defiance. "Won't let it?" The figure's voice was mocking, cruel. "You aren't. You were always meant to be. From the very moment you stepped foot on this land." Lucy felt her hands tremble, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest like an anchor. She had always known there was something wrong with this place, something dark and insidious beneath the surface. But the reality of it now, the truth of the lodge, the hunger that it represented, was overwhelming. "You can't fight what's inside you, Lucy." The figure took one more slow, deliberate step. "What's inside you can never be outrun. It will consume you, like it has consumed so many before you." Mark stood firm, his jaw clenched. "We choose to fight. We choose to survive." The figure's eyes glinted with an emotion that could almost be mistaken for amusement. "You think you can fight what has been here long before you arrived?" He stepped forward, his shadow stretching to swallow them whole. "You think you can fight something that has always been inside your very blood?" There was a flash of movement outside the cabin, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches underfoot. The creature, the one from outside, was closing in. The low growl vibrated through the air, its sound now a pulsing force that echoed like a heartbeat. It was drawing closer with every passing second. "We need to leave now," Mark said, urgency creeping into his voice. "We're running out of time." But before they could make a move, the figure raised his hand, a single sharp motion that froze them in place. The door to the cabin slammed shut with a violent bang, and the air inside became thick and suffocating. "You cannot run," the figure whispered again, his voice barely audible but filled with an insidious power. "You can never outrun what is waiting inside." Lucy's heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't breathe. She could feel the hunger closing in from all sides, the pull of something dark and ancient deep within the earth beneath them. And then, suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The air shifted, growing heavy, and the floorboards cracked under the force of an unseen power. The very cabin seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves were made of living, breathing flesh. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched long into the walls, twisting and growing. Lucy gasped. The floor beneath them cracked wide open, splintering apart, and from the darkness below, a thick black mist poured up through the cracks, seeping into the room like tendrils of smoke, curling around their legs, pulling at them, dragging them toward the ground. "No. Get back!" Mark shouted, pulling Lucy back from the swirling mist, but the more they fought, the tighter the mist gripped them. It felt like it was alive, a force of nature pulling at their very souls. Lucy screamed in terror as the darkness encroached, swallowing the room whole, the oppressive weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She could feel the pull of something deeper now, the lodge reaching up from below, as if the entire world was consuming them. The figure in the corner laughed. "It's too late. The hunger has you now. It always has." Mark raised the knife, but before he could strike, the room erupted in chaos. The floor beneath them cracked wide open, the darkness below swallowing the walls, the very foundation of the cabin. The creature outside roared, its claws scraping against the walls, rattling the fragile wood. And then, with a final deafening crash, the world gave way. They fell. For what felt like an eternity, Lucy and Mark plunged into darkness, the ground giving way beneath them. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the scent of something ancient and long forgotten. It was suffocating, pressing down on them from all sides, a relentless weight that threatened to crush them. The dark mist followed them, swirling around them, wrapping itself around their limbs like an invisible shackle. And then, just as they thought they would be swallowed whole by the darkness, they landed. The impact knocked the breath from Lucy's chest, and she gasped, her hands trembling as she pushed herself up from the cold, damp floor. Her vision swam, but she forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. Mark's hand found hers, pulling her up beside him. The air was different here, thick, moist, and heavy, like the very atmosphere had been drowned in the earth's deepest secrets. The walls around them were jagged, twisted, formed from ancient rock and gnarled roots that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to breathe, the soil shifting as if something was buried deep within it, waiting, watching. Lucy's eyes darted around the cavernous space, the endless shadows stretching into infinity. There was no escape here, no way out. Just the deep, oppressive silence of the lodge, the very thing that had been pulling them deeper, drawing them into its heart. The creature outside was silent now, but its presence still hung in the air, heavy and dark, like a predator waiting for its prey. Lucy's throat tightened. "Where are we?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. This place, it's alive." The ground shifted beneath their feet again, and Lucy felt it, a tremor, a movement deep within the earth. The darkness was closing in around them. They were no longer just inside the lodge. They were beneath it. The air was damp, heavy with the musty scent of decay, and the darkness felt thicker here, almost tangible, like it was alive, waiting, watching. Lucy's pulse hammered in her ears as she and Mark stood in the cavernous chamber, their eyes straining to make sense of the oppressive void around them. The earth beneath their feet felt unnervingly soft, as if it were slowly shifting, breathing, pulling them deeper into the bowels of the lodge. Every sound, every whisper, every crackle, felt amplified in the silence, as though the very walls of this place were absorbing them, hungry for any intrusion. The shadows moved, seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The air was alive with the presence of something ancient, something far older than the trees, the forest, or even the lodge itself. "You feel that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Lucy nodded, her throat tight, every muscle in her body on high alert. The feeling of being watched, the sense that they were intruding on something far more dangerous than the creature outside, gnawed at her insides. It was as if the darkness around them had intelligence, as if it could see them, knew them in ways they couldn't understand. The shadows shifted again, this time more deliberately, coiling like snakes, tightening around them. It was almost as though the very walls were alive, watching, closing in on them. Lucy's heart fluttered wildly as she instinctively took a step closer to Mark. "I don't know if I can stand this," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It feels like we're being suffocated." Mark's hand found hers, and she could feel his fingers trembling. She squeezed back, trying to ground herself, trying to fight the overwhelming dread threatening to consume them both. He looked around, his eyes darting to the shadows, the twisted roots that seemed to crawl up the cavern walls like veins feeding off the earth's lifeblood. "It's not just the cabin, Lucy. This place is alive," Mark muttered, his voice strained. "It's feeding off us. We've gone too deep." There was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo through the walls, coming from below. Something ancient, primal, a sound that made her bones ache. The ground shook again, just enough to make her feet wobble. But it was more than just an earthquake. It felt like something was awakening beneath them, stirring in the depths of the earth, stirring in the lodge. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The warmth from the surface above them seemed like a distant memory as the cold crept in, seeping into their bones. It was the kind of cold that felt alive, a cold that burned as much as it numbed. "We need to move," Mark said, his voice low but full of urgency. "We have to get out of here." Lucy didn't argue. She followed Mark as he turned, his movements swift, purposeful, but the darkness pressed in from all sides, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of them. They stumbled through the dense, twisting roots, their shoes sinking into the soft earth with every step. But even as they moved, the air around them grew thicker, almost like they were walking through a web of suffocating energy, each step more labored than the last. The further they went, the more disorienting it became. Every tunnel, every turn, seemed to lead them deeper into the belly of the beast. There was no sense of direction, no sense of escape. It was like the lodge itself had turned into a labyrinth, a place with no exit. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though the walls were closing in on them. Then ahead something caught her eye. A flicker of movement. A shape. At first, it was only a shadow just out of reach of their vision, but it was moving, swaying like the branches of a tree in the wind. It was tall, and it seemed to glide rather than walk, its form shifting in and out of the darkness like smoke. The hairs on the back of Lucy's neck stood on end, and her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tell what it was, but the way it moved was wrong. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you see that?" He turned, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment, Lucy could have sworn she saw a flicker of fear in them, something that mirrored her own unease. "I see it," he said, his voice tense. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." The shape continued to glide toward them, drawing closer, its movements graceful, eerie. It was not a figure they recognized, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with an unsettling energy. The shadows themselves seemed to bend, bow to its presence. And then it stopped. So. The figure stood, its form casting an impossible shadow in the dim light, its shape so ethereal, so unsettling, that Lucy felt her pulse spike in her chest. It was like a wraith, tall and thin, with glowing empty eyes that flickered with a strange, sickly light. Its limbs were elongated, impossibly so, twisting at angles that seemed unnatural, its joints cracking as it shifted its position. The skin, or what passed for it, was stretched too tight over its bones, pale and slick, like it was made of something other than flesh. Lucy's breath hitched in her throat. "What is that?" Mark didn't answer, but she could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles were coiled, ready to spring into action. But even as he tensed, the creature didn't move. It was watching them, its eyes never leaving them, as though it were studying them, weighing them, deciding whether to attack or play with them. "It's not alive," Mark murmured after a long pause. "It's something else." The creature's lips parted in a wide, grotesque grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth that seemed to reflect the dim, eerie light. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the air, like the sound of distant thunder, but there was no storm, no lightning. Just this thing standing before them, grinning like it had all the time in the world. And then it spoke. "You're here," it whispered, its voice a mixture of 1,000 voices, all distorted and hollow, filling the air around them. "You belong here." The word sent a chill through Lucy's spine, and she instinctively backed up, pulling Mark with her. She had no idea what this thing was, but she knew it wasn't something they could fight. Not with a knife. Not with anything they had. "We are the hunger," the creature continued, its voice a mixture of agony and desire. "We have always been the hunger." Mark's face tightened with determination. "We won't be part of whatever you are," he growled. But the creature only laughed, a sound that was both melodic and terrifying, the kind of laugh that made the very air around them seem to ripple with dark energy. "You will be," it said softly, almost lovingly, its grin widening even further. "The lodge has you, and it will never let you go." With a sudden lurch, the creature advanced, its long limbs stretching out unnaturally toward them, its mouth opening wide, showing the endless void within. It wasn't a mouth, it was a portal, a black hole that seemed to pull everything in. Before they could react, the creature lunged forward with inhuman speed, but Mark shoved Lucy behind him, pushing her out of the way. "No!" Lucy screamed, grabbing for him. But it was too late. The creature's long, gnarled fingers wrapped around Mark's arm, its grip crushing, suffocating. Mark grunted, but there was no escape. The creature's eyes flared, glowing brighter as it pulled him closer. Lucy reached out, her fingers grazing Mark's hand, but the distance between them seemed to stretch, to widen impossibly, as if the darkness itself was expanding, swallowing them. "No!" Lucy cried again, her voice a raw sob. The creature's eyes glinted with malice, its grin never wavering. "It's too late," it said, its voice 100 echoes all at once. "You are already ours." And with that, the creature disappeared into the darkness, dragging Mark with it, vanishing into the very earth, leaving Lucy alone in the suffocating shadows of the lodge. The ground trembled beneath her, the air thick with despair. Mark was gone. The lodge had taken him. And Lucy was left to face the terrible truth. There was no escape. The cavern around Lucy was deafeningly silent, the heavy, suffocating air pressing down on her chest like the weight of 1,000 years. Her heart hammered in her ears, louder than anything else, but she couldn't focus on that. She couldn't focus on anything but the emptiness where Mark had been. The creature, the thing, had taken him, swallowed him whole, dragged him into the bowels of the earth without a sound, without even a struggle. The space where he had been standing moments before seemed to close in on itself, as if the very walls of the cavern were conspiring to erase the memory of his presence. Lucy was alone. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven now, as if the earth itself was shifting. The walls of the cavern were closing in, their jagged surfaces pressing inward, their twisted roots and stone like fingers reaching out to pull her down. Her breath was shallow, ragged, and her legs felt like they would give way at any moment. The darkness was overwhelming, swallowing her thoughts, smothering her will to move. But she couldn't stay like this. She couldn't let the darkness win. "Mark!" she screamed into the void, her voice cracking, echoing off the stone walls. The sound was swallowed up by the cavern's endless depths, disappearing into the dark. She shouted again, but there was no answer. No sign that Mark had even existed. It was as if the world had simply erased him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely, her fists clenched at her sides. She had to keep going. She had to fight, even if she was the only one left. The lodge had taken him, but it would not take her. Not without a fight. Lucy's mind raced. The creature, the wraith-like thing, had called itself part of the lodge. Had Mark been taken as an offering? Was that creature the true hunger that had been festering in the dark for so long? The hunger that the lodge thrived on, that consumed all who wandered too deep? Her breath was shallow, but she forced herself to calm down. She had no time to wallow in fear. The lodge was not done with her yet. It had taken Mark, but it would not take her. It couldn't. She took a deep breath, forcing her limbs to move, her feet carrying her through the choking silence. The floor beneath her felt spongy now, like the very earth was alive with a hunger of its own, pulsing under her feet, drawing her closer to the depths of the cavern. The shadows shifted, almost imperceptibly, at the edge of her vision, as if the very space around her were alive, aware of her every step. She moved forward, despite the unease that gripped her insides. The path before her was a winding labyrinth of stone and twisted roots. The walls narrowed the further she went, closing in on her like a vice. There was no sense of direction anymore, just the oppressive darkness, the weight of the earth pressing down on her, as though it were trying to crush her under its ancient weight. Lucy's footsteps echoed in the dark, but it wasn't just her footsteps she heard. There were other sounds, faint at first, almost imperceptible. Low, scraping noises like nails against stone reverberating through the walls. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it the creature? Was it still following her? The sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, scraping, dragging, a slow, deliberate movement through the earth. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with every step it took. Her pulse quickened. No, she couldn't run. She couldn't outrun this. There was nowhere to hide. No shelter, no refuge. The lodge had no boundaries, no escape. It was everywhere, all-encompassing. It was a place, but also a force. It had no shape, no form, but it was more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. The scraping stopped abruptly. Lucy stood there, her breath held, waiting for whatever would come next. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds becoming endless, a thick fog of dread settling over her like a blanket. And then she heard it. A soft, familiar voice. "Lucy." It was Mark's voice. Her heart skipped a beat, hope flaring up in her chest, only to be crushed by the weight of the darkness. The voice was distorted, hollow, as though it were coming from far away, far beyond where Mark could possibly be. Yet, the sound of it twisted through her, like a lure, pulling her deeper into the cavern. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and desperation. "Mark, is that you?" There was a long silence. And then the voice came again, this time lower, more insistent. "Lucy, come closer." Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard that voice before, heard it in the depths of the lodge when it had twisted Mark into something he wasn't. The voice of the creature of the lodge, calling her, beckoning her into its depths. She knew better than to listen. But even as the words echoed in her mind, something tugged at her, an undeniable pull toward that voice, a longing that she couldn't explain. The darkness around her shifted again, thickening, pulsing, like it was alive with desire, drawing her in. She took a deep breath, her body trembling, her instincts screaming at her to turn around and flee. But there was no running. She was already as deep as she could go, and no matter which direction she turned, it would only follow her. And so she moved toward the voice. Her steps were slow at first, hesitant. The shadows seemed to close around her tighter, the air growing colder with each breath she took. The ground shifted beneath her, but she kept going, driven by something she didn't fully understand. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but she had to know. She had to know if Mark was still in there, if there was any way to save him. She rounded a bend in the path, her eyes straining to see through the thick darkness, when she came upon something unexpected. A light. Faint. Flickering. A single candle burned on the stone floor before her, its flame dancing erratically in the damp, suffocating air. The flickering light cast strange, distorted shadows on the walls, and in that light she saw what she had been searching for. It was Mark, or at least what was left of him. His body was sprawled out on the floor, his skin pale, his eyes closed as though in deep sleep. He was breathing, but it was shallow, ragged. He was still alive, but something about him felt wrong. The air around him was thick with a presence, a sense of something dark and wrong, as though his body had been claimed by something far worse than death. Lucy rushed to his side, her heart pounding as she knelt beside him. "Mark? Mark, can you hear me?" Her hands shook as she reached out to touch his skin, her fingers brushing his cheek. It was cold. Too cold. He didn't stir. But as her hand lingered on his face, the darkness around them seemed to shift again. A low, bone-chilling hum filled the space, and the shadows grew thicker, moving closer. She could feel them tightening around her, creeping into her bones, pulling at her like the very air was alive. It was the lodge. It was using Mark to draw her in, to feed on her despair, on her fear. The dark presence pushed closer, its voice whispering through the cavern like an ancient chant. "Come closer, Lucy. Come closer." She was no longer sure if the words were coming from Mark or from the thing that had claimed him. The shadows stretched toward her, their tendrils curling like fingers reaching to pull her into the void. "Mark," she screamed, shaking him, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, fight it." But the only answer was the low hum of the lodge, the whispers of the darkness, calling her in, pulling her closer as the shadows began to rise. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and the earth groaned as if the cavern itself was waking, shifting, drawing in its prey. Lucy's vision blurred, her limbs heavy, her heart thundering as the weight of the darkness pressed down on her. She could feel herself being drawn in, the shadows curling around her ankles, climbing her legs like snakes, pulling her down toward the earth. "No!" she screamed, her voice a ragged cry. She fought with everything she had, but the shadows had her. She was sinking, falling deeper into the earth. But before she could succumb, something, or someone, pulled her back. Mark's hand. His fingers were cold, but they were wrapped around her wrist, pulling her up, lifting her from the darkness. She gasped as he dragged her toward the light, his face pale, his eyes blank and distant. The lodge hadn't claimed him yet, and as they struggled together, she knew that they still had a chance. But they had to escape. They had to fight. The lodge had them. But they were not lost yet. The shadows had clung to Lucy like a second skin, their tendrils wrapping around her legs, her arms, pulling her down into the very heart of the lodge. The darkness had been so close, so overwhelming, and she felt herself slipping inch by inch toward the deep, suffocating abyss. But then, in the depths of that terrifying pull, she had felt him, Mark. His cold, trembling hand had seized hers, yanked her back from the edge. His grip was weak, his body unnaturally cold, but it was enough. It was the lifeline she needed. "Mark," she gasped, her voice hoarse with disbelief and desperation. She looked at him, his face pale, his eyes distant, as though he were not fully there. His body was too still, too lifeless. His features were gaunt, like the life had been drained from him. Yet, in his eyes, there was a flicker, something faint, something that reminded her of the man she had fought to protect. He squeezed her wrist tighter, his fingers trembling like they might snap. "Lucy," his voice was hollow, cracked, but it was his voice. "You shouldn't have come." She shook her head violently, refusing to let the despair seep back in. "I'm not leaving you here," she whispered fiercely. "We're getting out. Together. You hear me, Mark? Together." Mark's lips barely parted in a faint, broken smile, but it was quickly replaced by a look of exhaustion, of something deeper, something darker. "You don't understand," he said, his voice a rasp. "The lodge has already claimed me. I'm not the same. I'm tainted." "No," Lucy said, her heart racing, her voice rising with panic. "That's not true. You're still you. The Mark I know is still inside." The world around them seemed to constrict, as if the very air was pushing in on them, drawing them into the suffocating grip of the lodge. The shadows grew, curling tighter around their feet, pulling at their bodies like invisible hands. The cavern around them was a swirling, living nightmare, the walls shifting with an eerie, almost sentient presence. The whispering returned. "Lucy, come closer. There's no escape. You're already part of us. You belong to the hunger." The voice slithered through her mind like 1,000 insects crawling under her skin, trying to take root, to burrow deep into her soul. It was the voice of the lodge. It was everywhere, all around them, feeding on their fear, their pain, their desperation. Mark's grip on her wrist tightened again, but there was something different in his eyes now, something distant. He was fighting something within himself, something that she couldn't fully understand, but the anguish in his gaze made it clear that he was losing. "I can feel it," he whispered, his breath shallow, his voice breaking. "It's pulling me in, Lucy. The hunger. It wants me. And now it wants you." Lucy's blood ran cold, but she refused to back down. She refused to lose him again. "No, you're not going anywhere. We are getting out of here. We fight it. We fight together." She pulled on his arm, trying to force him to his feet, but his body remained unmoving, his eyes hollow with that dark, implacable force inside him. "I don't think I can fight it anymore," he said, his voice a low, resigned murmur. I think it's too late for me." "No," Lucy cried, her voice cracking. "You can fight this. We can still escape." For a moment, the shadows around them seemed to pause as though they were holding their breath. Then the ground beneath their feet trembled again, a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the walls of the cavern. It was the heartbeat of the lodge, and it was growing louder, faster, as if the very earth were stirring with anticipation, waiting for them to fall. Lucy's eyes darted around, frantic, searching for anything that might give them a way out. The candlelight flickered and danced before them, casting strange, eerie shadows across the cavern's walls. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere weighed down on her chest, and she could feel the lodge closing in, its presence like a monstrous, unseen hand around her throat. Then, in the flickering light, she saw something. Something she hadn't noticed before. A door. It was carved into the stone wall, hidden almost completely by the twisting roots and shadows, but it was there. A doorway, small, narrow, but a way out. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. "That's it," she whispered to herself. "That's the way out. We can make it through." Mark's hand went limp in hers, and for a moment she feared he had slipped away. But then, through the haze of the lodge's darkness, his voice cracked once more. "You're not listening," he said, his words ragged, his voice barely audible. "There's no way out, Lucy. The lodge is everywhere. It is the way. It is the land. It is the earth. We're all part of it now. We always were." Tears welled in her eyes, her vision blurring. But she blinked them away. She would not lose him. Not now. "I don't care what it wants," she said, her voice steady, cold with resolve. "We're leaving this place. We're not becoming part of it. Not today." She grabbed his arm with all the strength she had left, pulling him toward the door. Mark stumbled, his steps uneven, his weight like dead weight in her hands, but she didn't care. She couldn't care. She had to get him to safety. And yet, the closer they came to the door, the more the shadows pressed in. They swirled around them, thick and heavy, dragging at their limbs, whispering in their ears, pulling at their souls. "Come closer. You cannot escape. It's in your blood." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Lucy felt them clawing at her mind, at her very sense of self. They were trying to drown her, trying to erase her will, to make her forget who she was, who they both were. "Mark," she cried, tugging harder, her voice breaking. "Please, fight it, please." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her voice, the deep hum of the lodge's presence, and the oppressive silence that followed. Then, slowly, with a ragged, trembling breath, Mark lifted his head. His eyes were unfocused, but there was a flicker of something there. Something real. Something human. "Lucy, I'm sorry." She didn't let him finish. She pulled him forward, dragging him past the walls of shadows, past the thrumming, echoing heartbeat of the lodge. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she knew she might lose her resolve. Together, they reached the door. It wasn't much, just a small, arched passageway, its edges carved into the rock and covered by roots, but it was an opening, a path, a way. She grabbed the stone handle with shaking hands and wrenched it open. It creaked, the sound echoing in the cavern as if the very lodge were protesting her escape, but she didn't care. She didn't stop. She pulled Mark through, and together they stumbled into the narrow passage beyond. It was dark here too, but there was a difference. This darkness didn't feel alive. It didn't pulse or breathe or whisper. It was just darkness, still and silent. For a moment, they were free of the lodge's weight, free from the suffocating presence of the hunger. But the further they moved into the passage, the more Lucy realized something. The walls of the passage were shifting too. The shadows in the corners were moving. And something far worse than the lodge itself was waiting for them ahead. The hunger wasn't a place. It was a force, and it had followed them. The narrow passage was damp and cold, its walls pressing in on them as they moved deeper into the earth. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and rot, and every step they took felt like it was pulling them further into the heart of the lodge, where no light had ever touched, where no escape had ever existed. Mark stumbled beside her, his breath shallow, ragged. His body felt unnaturally cold, like it was made of something other than flesh and bone. Lucy kept her grip tight on his arm, pulling him along with her, urging him forward, but his steps were slow, unsteady, like he was being weighed down by something invisible. "Mark, come on," she urged, her voice trembling. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop now. Please." His eyes flickered toward her, their dark, hollow depths filled with an unreadable emptiness. He said nothing, but the way he leaned against her for support made her chest tighten with fear. He was slipping further away from her, his body slowly being consumed by the very thing they had been running from, the thing that had taken hold of him in the first place. The walls of the passage seemed to close in tighter, the darkness becoming more oppressive with each step. The low hum of the lodge's presence was growing louder again, vibrating through the walls, the ground, their very bones. It was a constant, unrelenting pressure, like the earth itself was alive and aware of their every movement. "We can't let it win," Lucy muttered to herself, more to steady her own racing thoughts than anything else. "We can't." Her voice trailed off as she heard a sound behind them. It was faint at first, just the scraping of something heavy against the stone floor, slow and deliberate. But it grew louder with each passing second, the sound of claws or talons dragging against the rock. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, eyes wide with panic, but all she saw was the same dark passage behind them. Empty. Silent. Too silent. Mark looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "Lucy, what's wrong?" Before she could respond, the sound grew louder still. The walls around them began to tremble, as if the passage itself was shaking in fear, as if something deep below the earth had awakened and was stirring. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the sound of movement, it was the feeling too. The ground beneath them was shifting again, as if the very earth was coming to life, writhing and twisting beneath their feet. "It's following us," she whispered, the realization hitting her with a sharp, cold clarity. The lodge, the hunger, the thing that had claimed Mark, had followed them. The shadows had never truly left. They were still there, just waiting, lurking in the dark, ready to drag them back. Mark's grip on her arm tightened, his nails digging into her skin, as if he were clinging to her for life. "Lucy, I don't think we can outrun it." She could feel the tremor in his voice, the way his body was starting to shake, and her heart broke for him. He was losing himself to the darkness, losing himself to the hunger that had already begun to claim his soul. "No," she said fiercely, pulling him forward. "We're not giving up. We're getting out of here. We're leaving. Together." But the further they went, the darker it got. The shadows seemed to close in on them from all sides, pressing against them, suffocating them. The sound behind them, the scraping, the dragging, was getting closer. Louder. Stronger. It was relentless, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Mark, we have to go faster," Lucy urged, her voice shaking now. "It's coming." Mark didn't answer. His steps were slower now, dragging. His body felt like it was becoming a dead weight, and Lucy could see the struggle in his eyes. He was fighting something, fighting the hunger, fighting the pull of the lodge, but it was clear that he was losing. She could feel it in the way his body was slipping from her grip, in the way his eyes had dulled, as if the life was being drained from him bit by bit. "Please, Mark," she begged, shaking him slightly. "Don't give in. Don't let it take you." His eyes flickered up to hers, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, it was like he was truly seeing her again. There was a spark of recognition, a flicker of the man she loved, buried beneath the hunger, beneath the darkness that was eating away at him. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he whispered, his voice cracked. I tried to fight it, but it's too strong. It's too late for me." "No." Lucy's voice broke, the tears she'd been holding back flooding her eyes. "It's not too late. We can still make it out of here. Please, Mark, please don't give up on me." But Mark's expression hardened, his gaze shifting away from her, as though something inside him was already slipping into the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, that spark of recognition was gone, replaced by something hollow and void-like. The man she loved had faded, swallowed whole by the lodge. She turned back to the path ahead of them, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. There was no time left. They had to keep moving. And then she saw it. Ahead of them, the narrow passageway suddenly opened into a vast, dark chamber, a cavern far larger than any they had passed through before. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into the blackness. The walls were lined with strange, twisted roots that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, reaching out like the fingers of a giant, hungry creature. The air in the cavern was thick with a palpable energy, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to press down on her, suffocating her with its weight. It was as if the very space itself was alive, aware of their presence, and it was waiting for them to fall. Lucy stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering. Something was wrong. The entire cavern was wrong. It felt like the very ground was waiting for them to step forward, to give in to the hunger that lurked within. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "Mark, do you feel that?" He didn't respond. She turned to him, but he had stopped moving. His face was pale, his eyes distant, his body standing completely still as if frozen in place. His lips moved slowly as if he were speaking, but no sound came out. "Mark?" Lucy called again, but he still didn't answer. She reached out to him, but just as her fingers brushed his arm, she felt the tremor in the ground beneath her feet. The walls of the cavern began to shake violently, and a deep, rumbling growl reverberated through the very earth. The shadows around them began to swirl, forming a massive vortex in the center of the cavern. And then she saw it. From the swirling darkness, something emerged. It was massive, towering over them, its form dark and indistinct, made of twisting roots and shadows, its shape constantly shifting, impossible to define. It was like a giant creature, half animal, half nightmare, a thing born of the very earth itself. It was the hunger, the lodge. It had come for them. "No," Lucy whispered, backing away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. The creature's form continued to grow, stretching out with tendrils of darkness that reached for her, for Mark. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, an insatiable hunger that seemed to pierce through her very soul. Mark's body was still frozen in place, his eyes locked on the creature with an expression of pure despair. He had already given in. The lodge had taken him, and now it was coming for her. Her hands shook, her legs felt weak, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't stand still. She had to keep moving. The ground trembled once more, and with a heart-stopping roar, the creature lunged, its massive form surging forward with terrifying speed. The shadows around Lucy swallowed the light, and in the pitch-black darkness, she could feel the hunger closing in on her, pulling her closer, dragging her into the abyss. "Mark!" she screamed, reaching out to him one last time. But there was nothing left to save. The hunger had won, and she was next. The world around Lucy blurred as the shadows swarmed, thick and suffocating, dragging at her, tightening like invisible hands around her throat. The very air seemed to vibrate with an unholy energy, the ground shaking beneath her feet as the massive creature, the hunger, loomed larger and larger before her, its form flickering like an ill-defined nightmare, only the glow of its eyes piercing the overwhelming darkness. She could feel the crushing weight of despair closing in on her. The cavern walls, the very ground, the air, all of it was alive with that dark presence, a cold, hungry thing that had been waiting, feeding for eons. It was all around her, its influence seeping into her skin, into her very soul. The dread was suffocating, a poison that seeped into her thoughts, filling them with doubt, with despair. But she couldn't let it win. Not like this. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears as the shadows crept closer, the tendrils of the creature's form reaching for her, its dark, twisting limbs impossibly long, impossibly fast. It was too strong, too powerful, she couldn't escape. There was no way out. Her breath quickened as she stepped back, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The cavern felt like it was alive, shifting beneath her as if the very stone wanted to swallow her whole. The creature's growl rumbled through the walls, a deep, gut-wrenching sound that vibrated through her body, shaking her to her core. It was drawing closer. In the dim light, she could see the glowing eyes of the creature, its insatiable gaze locked onto her, hungry, waiting. She couldn't escape. She couldn't outrun it. It was too fast, too powerful, and she was too weak. No, the thought cut through her like a knife. She couldn't stop fighting. She couldn't let it win. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to push the fear, the terror down into the pit of her stomach, where it could fester, but where it wouldn't control her. The darkness, the hunger, it wanted her fear. It fed off it, but she couldn't give it that. Not now. Think, Lucy. Think. Her eyes darted around the cavern, searching desperately for something, anything, that might help her. There had to be a way out, some way to defeat it. The shadows around her seemed to pulse in response to her thoughts, as though the lodge itself was listening, aware of her every move, every heartbeat, every breath. But then her eyes fell upon something. It was faint at first, just a glimmer of light in the far corner of the cavern, a small, flickering flame that caught her attention. It was coming from something in the distance, almost hidden beneath the twisted roots that snaked across the cavern floor. A fire. A fire in the depths of this nightmare. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a wave. The fire, it could be the key. She didn't know how, didn't know why, but in this place where darkness and hunger thrived, fire had to have some power. It had to be a force capable of pushing back against the shadows. Without thinking, she rushed toward it, her heart hammering as her legs carried her across the uneven ground, stumbling over roots and loose stones. The shadows writhed around her, the darkness closing in, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Behind her, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its massive form growing nearer, faster, its shadow swallowing the light. She could hear the scraping of its claws against the stone, feel the tremors of its presence in the air. It was coming. It was too close. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the fire, a small flickering flame that was perched in a stone brazier, surrounded by strange ancient markings on the floor, like a forgotten ritual. The fire wasn't large, but its light, its warmth, felt like salvation in the suffocating darkness. It was a lifeline, a beacon in this pitch-black hell. Lucy knelt before it, her hands trembling as she reached for the flame. For a moment, her fingers hovered above the fire, the heat licking her skin, but she hesitated. She had no idea what she was doing, no understanding of what this fire was, but she couldn't afford to doubt now. She couldn't afford to let fear consume her. She grabbed a nearby branch, one of the twisted roots that had been draped around the brazier, and thrust it into the flames. The wood caught fire almost instantly, a bright, fierce blaze that illuminated the cavern around her in stark contrast to the shadows. The darkness hissed in response. And then the world shook. A low, bone-rattling tremor ran through the earth, as if the very foundations of the lodge were cracking, breaking apart. The creature howled, its voice a cacophony of screams that reverberated through the cavern, shaking the walls, the ground, the very air. But Lucy didn't hesitate. She took the burning branch, her hands steady despite the terror clawing at her chest, and thrust it toward the shadows. She swung it through the darkness like a weapon, the flame cutting through the oppressive void, lighting up the air around her. The shadows recoiled, hissing like creatures in pain, their forms twitching and twisting as though the fire burned them. The creature screeched in fury, its glowing eyes narrowing, the massive form of its body lurching forward, but the fire pushed it back. The flames grew brighter as the creature hesitated, recoiling from the light. For a moment, it looked as though the creature was retreating, unwilling to face the force of the fire. But Lucy knew that wasn't enough. The fire was pushing it back, yes, but it wasn't enough to destroy it. She needed more. She needed to do more than just drive it away. The fire was only a temporary solution. A thought flashed in her mind. The fire. It wasn't just light. It wasn't just heat. It was life. In that instant she understood. The fire was the opposite of the hunger. It was creation, warmth, growth, the very force that the lodge sought to destroy. The lodge thrived on decay, on consuming, on feeding off the darkness. But fire was the spark of life, the birth of something new. Lucy grabbed another branch, her heart pounding as she thrust it into the flames, holding it like a sword. The fire flared brighter, hotter, its light cutting through the darkness. The creature hissed, its form lashing out, but the flames seared through its shadowy tendrils, burning them away like paper. The creature howled in agony, its form flickering, losing shape, its black mass crumbling as if it were made of nothing more than smoke. But it wasn't enough. The creature was still there, still hunting. Lucy stepped forward, her hands shaking, her heart racing, but her mind clear. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore. She was fighting for everything the lodge had consumed, for everything it had taken. The fire, this light, was her weapon. She would use it to burn away the darkness. She advanced, the flames crackling around her, the fire in her hands like a shield. The darkness recoiled again, the hunger shrieking in fury, but Lucy didn't stop. She walked toward the creature, toward the heart of the lodge, her every step pushing back the shadows. The creature's form twisted violently, its limbs stretching and writhing as it reached out, but the fire cut through its tendrils, reducing them to ash in the blink of an eye. With one final, guttural scream, the creature lunged forward, its jaws opening wide, the dark maw ready to swallow her whole. But Lucy was ready. She thrust the fire into its face, into the very center of its being, and in that instant the creature shattered. The fire exploded, its light brighter than the sun, hotter than anything Lucy had ever felt. The darkness writhed in agony, its form dissolving like smoke in a gust of wind. The walls of the cavern shook violently, the ground cracking open as if the very earth were being torn apart. The roar of the creature's death echoed through the cavern, and for a moment, Lucy was sure she would be swallowed by the storm of light and shadow. But then all was silent. The creature was gone. The darkness had been burned away. Lucy stood alone in the cavern, the fire still crackling in her hands, its light flickering weakly but steady. The lodge was silent now, the hum of its hunger gone. The shadows no longer reached for her. The air, though still thick with the remnants of the darkness, felt lighter. She took a ragged breath, her body trembling from the exertion. The fire in her hands slowly faded, its embers dimming. She had done it. She had survived. And for the first time since she had entered the lodge, she felt the weight of her fear, her dread lift from her shoulders. It was not over, but she had won a small victory. The lodge's hunger had been silenced, for now. But she knew it wasn't gone. It never would be. The hunger had only been temporarily driven back. The cavern was eerily silent now, the oppressive darkness that had once weighed heavily on Lucy's chest now dissipating like smoke in the wind. The fire's light flickered weakly in her hand, casting faint shadows on the jagged stone walls. But the silence that followed the creature's death wasn't peaceful. It was a hollow silence, a silence that echoed with the absence of something far more dangerous, something that would never truly leave. Lucy's breath came in shallow gasps, her limbs trembling from exhaustion. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, her pulse still racing from the adrenaline of the battle. She had done it. The creature, the hunger, was gone. But she knew deep down that this was not the end. The lodge was not so easily defeated. It was an ancient force, a presence that had existed for longer than time itself, and no amount of fire could truly destroy it. The hunger was woven into the very fabric of the earth, a shadow that would never fade entirely. She glanced around the cavern, her mind still reeling from the chaos. The walls, once pulsating with the lodge's malevolent energy, now seemed still, frozen in the aftermath of the fire's destructive power. The roots that had once wriggled and stretched like the arms of some dark giant were now charred and still, their twisted forms reduced to blackened husks. The ground beneath her feet, once alive with movement, now felt as though it had been drained of all life. She lowered the still glowing branch in her hand, watching the flames flicker weakly before they finally died out. The warmth that had once been comforting now felt cold, distant. The fire had done its job, it had driven back the darkness, but it had come at a cost. She could feel it. The weight of the battle had taken its toll on her. Every muscle in her body ached, and her thoughts were muddled, clouded by the sheer intensity of the struggle. But she could not stop now. Mark. Lucy's eyes flickered toward the spot where Mark had stood just moments before. He was still there, frozen, his body slumped as if he were made of stone. His face was pale, drained of color, and his eyes, once so full of life, now looked distant, lifeless. He was there but not there. He had been pulled into the hunger, consumed by the lodge in a way that she could not understand. His body had become a vessel for something much older, much darker. But he was still alive. Lucy took a slow, shuddering breath, her gaze never leaving him. She had to save him. She had to. She had fought for her survival, fought against the very darkness that had nearly consumed them both, but now she had to fight for him. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. With trembling hands, she stepped toward him, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavern as she knelt beside his motionless form. His skin was cold to the touch, like ice, and she could feel the faintest pulse beneath his skin, a thread of life that was barely hanging on. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, but it was as though something inside him had been shut off, locked away by the lodge's dark influence. "Mark," she whispered, her voice soft, desperate. "Please, please come back to me." Her hands moved to his face, brushing the damp strands of hair away from his forehead. The touch was gentle, as though she were afraid that if she pressed too hard, she would break him. His eyes fluttered, just the slightest movement, and for a moment, Lucy thought he might wake, might return to her. But then, just as quickly as the hope had sparked in her chest, it dimmed. His eyes remained closed, and his body stayed motionless, as if he were lost to the shadows. The hunger had taken too much of him. She had fought so hard to save him. But how could she bring him back from this? "Mark," she whispered again, her voice shaking. "I can't lose you. You're not gone. I won't let you be gone." Her mind raced as she searched for something, anything, that might help, some way to pull him from the depths of the lodge's influence. But the fire had burned brightly, and its light had faded. She had destroyed the creature, but that wasn't enough. It was never enough. The lodge would always come back, always find a way to claw its way into the world again. And Mark had become part of it. A quiet sob escaped Lucy's lips, and she clutched his hand tighter, feeling the coldness of his fingers, the life that was slipping away from him with every passing second. But she couldn't let go. She wouldn't. And then, as if in response to her desperation, something in the distance shifted. A soft whisper, almost too faint to hear, slithered through the air. It wasn't the deep growl of the creature, nor the voice of the hunger. It wasn't even the whispers of the lodge. It was something else. It was her. Lucy stiffened, her breath caught in her throat as the voice echoed around her. She knew that voice. She had heard it before, deep in the labyrinthine halls of the lodge, when the shadows had first tried to claim her. "Lucy." It was a soft, melodic sound, soothing, almost comforting, but it sent a chill down her spine. It was the same voice she had heard when she had been drawn into the depths of the lodge, the same voice that had whispered promises of despair and hopelessness. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Lucy, you know what must be done." Her head snapped toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. It was coming from the darkness. The shadows that had once seemed defeated now began to stir again, rising from the cracks in the stone, swirling in the corners of the cavern like smoke, like tendrils of mist. But this time they were different. There was something in them, something that seemed to call to her, a force that beckoned her closer. She stood up, her legs shaking with the weight of what she was about to do. The shadows seemed to reach for her, wrapping around her, caressing her like a lover's touch. And yet, in the very core of her being, she knew that they weren't her shadows. They were the lodge's. But there was something else, something familiar about them. Something she couldn't quite place. The voice returned, this time with more clarity. "You must give yourself to the hunger, Lucy." Her heart stopped. The shadows, the voice, they were trying to pull her back into the lodge. Trying to claim her just as they had claimed Mark. But she wouldn't let it. She couldn't. Not after everything she had fought for. Not after the fire had driven back the darkness. She had won. But what if the hunger couldn't be defeated by just fire? Lucy's mind reeled, the shadows swirling around her like an overwhelming tide. She could feel their presence, feel them clawing at her from the inside out. The hunger was calling her. It was begging her to surrender. The voice grew louder, almost pleading. "You can't escape, Lucy. You belong to it now. Just like him." Her mind raced, and she suddenly understood. The fire hadn't destroyed the hunger. It had only driven it back. The hunger had been dormant, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But this time it was different. This time she wasn't alone. Mark's hand twitched again, and her heart skipped a beat. He was still here. He wasn't gone. She couldn't fight this darkness alone. But maybe, just maybe, together they could defeat it. Lucy took a slow, steadying breath. She reached down and squeezed Mark's hand once more, feeling the faint pulse of life that remained in his cold, lifeless body. The shadows surged around her, their coldness seeping into her skin, into her thoughts, but she stood firm. "I won't be yours," she whispered through gritted teeth, her voice resolute. And then, with a strength she didn't know she had left, she closed her eyes and stepped forward into the shadows. If the hunger wanted her, wanted them, then she would face it. But this time she would be the one who controlled it. And this time she would find the way to break its hold once and for all. The darkness was still there, but so was she, and she would fight. The shadows twisted around Lucy like a living thing, their cold, creeping fingers brushing against her skin, seeping into her bones. She could feel them, feel their hunger clawing at her soul, whispering her name with promises of power, of release. It was all-consuming, this darkness. It was everything the lodge had ever been, everything it would always be. But Lucy had made a choice. She wasn't going to run anymore. She couldn't. The shadows around her darkened further, curling and spiraling like black smoke in a windless void. They moved with purpose, drawing closer, enveloping her. Their whispers became louder, more insistent, clawing into her mind like nails on a chalkboard. You are ours. You always have been. You cannot escape what you are. The hunger is within you. Lucy's eyes remained closed, her breath slow and steady, though every nerve in her body screamed for escape. She could feel the weight of the lodge pressing down on her, could feel it seeping into her skin, into her very essence. But she couldn't falter now. She couldn't. She had seen Mark. Seen how the lodge had taken him, consumed him, turning him into something unrecognizable. She had watched him fade, watched his light dim until all that was left was the hollow shell of the man she had loved. But she wasn't going to let that happen to her. Not like this. You belong to us, Lucy. You are the vessel, the key. You were born to feed the hunger. The voice echoed in her mind, smooth and serpentine, but Lucy remained silent. Her resolve was hardening, her will pushing back against the darkness that pressed in on all sides. The lodge was trying to break her, to pull her down into its endless, hungry maw, but Lucy knew something it didn't. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The flickering ember of light in the distance, the small fire that had started it all, was still burning, its light barely visible through the thick shadows, but it was there. It was a beacon. It was the last thing standing between her and the darkness, and Lucy would hold on to that light with everything she had left. Her hands trembled as she reached down into the dark, feeling for that tiny spark of warmth that still lingered in the very core of the lodge. Her fingers brushed against the ground, against the stone, and then, there it was, the faintest pulse of heat, a throb that was barely perceptible. It was a thread, a lifeline. The fire was still alive, but it was dying. The shadows closed in around her, pressing harder, suffocating, trying to extinguish that last flicker of hope. Lucy could feel it, the darkness strangling the warmth, trying to smother it. But she wasn't going to let it. Not now. She grabbed hold of that pulse of light and pulled. The shadows screamed, a deafening wail that rattled the walls of the cavern, their tendrils recoiling as if burned by the fire's warmth. The dark, malevolent force seemed to buck and twist, resisting the light, but Lucy held on tighter, her fingers digging into the stone, her body trembling with the effort of keeping the fire alive. The fire flared, its light growing brighter, stronger, like the sun rising in the midst of the endless night. The shadows writhed, pushing back, but Lucy didn't stop. She couldn't. You cannot keep it, Lucy. You cannot control what is not meant to be controlled. The voice was louder now, more insistent, a powerful surge of rage and fury that threatened to overwhelm her. But Lucy's grip tightened, her breath steady despite the overwhelming pressure. She was tired, so tired. Her body ached, her head pounded, and her heart felt like it might burst from the strain. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. The fire inside her roared to life, her soul burning with the very essence of the flames. It spread outward, filling her body, her mind, until she could feel it in her bones, coursing through her veins. She was the fire. She was the light. And nothing could take that from her. The shadows recoiled, hissing in pain, but they weren't retreating. They were trying to bind her, to pull her back, to claim her as one of their own. And in that moment, Lucy knew what she had to do. She had to embrace the hunger. She had to become it. You cannot destroy me, Lucy. You can only join me. The shadows surged again, a wave of darkness crashing down upon her, but Lucy stood her ground. She spread her arms wide, her body tense with the effort of channeling the fire inside her, of controlling it, even as the darkness tried to swallow her whole. The lodge wanted her. It wanted her to succumb, to bend to its will, to feed its eternal hunger. But Lucy knew better now. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for something more. For everything the lodge had taken from her, her life, her love, her sanity. She wasn't going to let it take Mark too. She let the fire spread from her hands, from her soul, unleashing it into the dark, claiming the shadows as her own. The flames lashed out like living creatures, cutting through the darkness, burning away the tendrils of the lodge as they reached for her. Each flicker of light was a blow against the hunger, each burst of heat a reminder that the darkness could not consume her. Not now, not ever again. You cannot control me, the voice whispered, softer now, its tone losing the power it once had. You are nothing but the fire. The fire cannot live without the hunger. Lucy's teeth gritted as she drew on every ounce of strength left inside her. She wasn't just a vessel. She wasn't just the fire. She was both. I am the fire. I am the light. And I will burn you down. The shadows screeched again, their form dissipating under the intensity of the light. They recoiled, burned by the flames, their once twisting bodies reduced to smoke and ash in the face of Lucy's unwavering resolve. The voice became a wail, a sound of desperation as the hunger, the very force of the lodge, began to unravel beneath her fire. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. The hunger wasn't part of her, it was the enemy, and she was going to burn it out. With one final, deafening cry, the shadows shattered. The darkness scattered into nothingness, consumed by the fire that had taken root in Lucy's soul. The cavern trembled, the ground shifting beneath her feet, but the fire stayed with her, blazing in her chest, filling her with its light, its heat. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time since she had set foot in the lodge, the world was quiet. The fire still burned, bright and strong within her. The shadows had been defeated, for now. The lodge, the hunger, had been pushed back into the depths from which it had come. The creatures, the whispers, the dark things that had once plagued her, all of them were gone. But Lucy knew the truth. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The hunger would return. It always did. The lodge had been there for centuries, feeding off the land, feeding off the fear, the pain. But Lucy knew now that she was different. She was not just the fire, but the one who controlled it. She was the flame that could burn the darkness away. And when it came again, as it inevitably would, she would be ready. Mark's body was still slumped where she had left him. His face was pale, but his chest rose and fell with slow, shallow breaths. There was no change in his appearance, no sign that the hunger had relinquished its hold on him. But Lucy's heart beat a little faster as she approached him. He wasn't gone. Not yet. He was waiting for her. She knelt beside him once more, her hand finding his. His skin was cold, but there was a faint warmth in his hand now. A sign, a flicker that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't lost after all. Mark, she whispered softly, her voice trembling. You're not gone. You're still here. I'm going to bring you back. I'm not leaving you. And this time she meant it. The fire was hers. And with it she would save him. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving the lodge behind. Not completely. The fire inside her was just beginning to burn. The fire in Lucy's chest still burned brightly, but it had transformed, evolving into something more controlled, more deliberate. The flames that had once threatened to consume her now simmered, an unyielding presence in the depths of her being. The hunger had been driven back, but the warmth that remained inside her felt like a smoldering ember, waiting for the moment it would ignite again. The darkness that had once overtaken her and Mark was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of her consciousness, as if it were waiting for its chance to return. She looked down at Mark's body, his cold skin a stark contrast to the fiery heat pulsing within her. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his body still locked in the death-like slumber the lodge had forced upon him. But she could feel it, feel the faintest pulse of life beneath her fingertips. It was weak, distant, but it was there. She wasn't going to leave him. Mark had been consumed by the hunger, lost to the lodge's grasp, but Lucy had fought through the darkest depths to reach him. And now she would bring him back. She would pull him from the brink of oblivion, from the shadows that had tried to claim him. The lodge hadn't completely taken him. Not yet. But the question remained, how? Lucy's heart ached as she gazed down at him. She had seen him slip away, had watched his eyes glaze over as the darkness overtook him. She had watched as the hunger tried to swallow him whole, as it tore apart the man she had loved. But now, his body lay motionless in front of her, his form as pale and lifeless as the stone around them. She closed her eyes and took a steadying breath. The fire within her responded to her focus, glowing brighter in the core of her chest. The light was still there, stronger than ever, and it was hers. It had been a part of her since she had first set foot in this cursed place. It had always been there, buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for the moment she would take control. Taking a deep breath, she placed both hands over Mark's chest, the heat of her palms mingling with the chill of his skin. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she steadied them, grounding herself. She could feel the faint warmth of his pulse beneath her touch, a thread of life struggling to hold on, a flicker of the man he used to be. It was weak, but it was enough. The lodge had tried to consume them both. It had tried to take her, to take Mark. But it hadn't succeeded. Not yet. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered softly, the words barely audible but filled with the weight of all her love, all her desperation. "Come back to me, Mark. Please. I won't let you go. You're not lost." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and quiet. But to Lucy they felt like a lifeline. She could feel the fire within her responding to the words, the energy within her rising and pulsing, as if the flames were drawn to her heart's desperate cry. For a moment nothing happened. The shadows still clung to the edges of the cavern, whispering in the darkness, but they seemed distant now, as if their presence had been diminished, overshadowed by the fire that had burned through them. The walls, once pulsating with malevolent energy, now stood still, silent and still. But Lucy could feel it, that faint sense of unease, the lingering threat of something not quite gone. The hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, waiting for its chance to reclaim her. But Mark was here. Mark was still with her. Her hands tightened over his chest as she focused, drawing the fire within her and channeling it outward. The heat within her flared, not with wild intensity but with purpose. The flames were steady, controlled, their warmth radiating from her palms and into his body. Her heart beat in rhythm with the rising fire, pulsing with the power of the lodge's own malevolent force but tempered by the light inside her. She wasn't just battling against the darkness anymore. She was becoming a force of her own. A soft whisper escaped her lips, more of a prayer than a command. "Mark, you have to fight. Fight with me. We can fight this together." The fire in her chest intensified, feeding the pulse of life she felt beneath her hands. She focused on it, coaxing it, feeding it warmth. Her mind focused on that spark, on the faint, fragile thread of life that remained in him. The shadows tried to cling to the edges of her thoughts, but she pushed them away, pushing them down into the depths of the earth where they belonged. Not today. Not now. She felt the warmth beneath her hands start to grow, just a little, as if Mark were responding, as if he were slowly beginning to stir from the depths of his sleep. His breath became deeper, more regular, the shallow gasps becoming steady inhales. His skin, once cold and lifeless, now had a faint warmth, a flush of color starting to return to his cheeks. Lucy's heart soared, but she did not let up. She could feel the fire inside her, strong and pure. But it was not just her fire. It was theirs. She was sharing it with him, giving him the warmth he needed to come back from the edge. "Please, Mark," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Come back to me. We can leave this place together. I won't let go. I won't lose you." Her palms tingled with the heat radiating from them, and she felt a faint, almost imperceptible pulse in his chest. It was barely a beat, just a flicker, but it was enough to send a wave of relief crashing over her. Mark wasn't lost. Not yet. He was still fighting. He was still here. But then something shifted. The shadows in the cavern seemed to stir again, their dark tendrils creeping closer, drawn by the light of the fire. The walls groaned, and the earth beneath them rumbled, as if the very foundation of the lodge were shifting in response to the flames. Lucy felt a cold gust of wind rush through the cavern, as if the lodge itself were awakening again, stirred by the power she was channeling. She held her ground. She couldn't let it take him. Not now. The air around them thickened, the dark energy in the cavern pulsing once more. The fire in her chest burned hotter, stronger, as she pushed with everything she had, flooding Mark's body with warmth, with life. She could feel the battle building inside her, the struggle between the fire she had become and the darkness that would never let go. The hunger was trying to reclaim its prize, to pull Mark back into the cold, lifeless abyss. But she wouldn't let it. Mark's hand twitched beneath hers. And then his eyes flickered. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice shaking with hope, with relief. "Mark, please?" His eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly as though he were trying to focus. His pupils were dilated, clouded with confusion, but there was a flicker of recognition there. His gaze met hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was something in his eyes. Something real. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice weak but full of that familiar tenderness. "Lucy." A tear slipped down her cheek and she leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. She could feel his warmth now, his life returning to him. The shadows in the cavern receded slightly as if they too recognized the shift. The fire had worked. It had pulled him back. But Lucy knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hunger had not been vanquished completely. The lodge had not been destroyed. And as she looked down at Mark, she knew that this was only the beginning of the war they would have to fight. The fire inside her could burn away the darkness for now, but the shadows would always come back. And next time they would have to be ready. But for now, Lucy allowed herself a moment. A single moment of victory. She had saved Mark. And together they would leave the lodge behind. Together they would find their way out. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they would walk away from this nightmare. And they would do it together. The fire still burned brightly within Lucy, a steady pulse of warmth that was now intertwined with Mark's breath, his heartbeat, his life. The shadows that had once threatened to engulf them both had receded for now, but Lucy knew that the lodge would never let them go. Not entirely. The hunger that had consumed them, the darkness that had stalked their every step, was still there, lurking in the edges of the world, waiting for its chance to return. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lucy felt the weight of the battle lift from her shoulders. Mark was back. He was breathing, alive, his pulse steady beneath her fingers, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The warmth of his skin seeped into her hands, and she could feel the fire within her responding to that warmth, as if the two of them were now bound by something stronger than the hunger, stronger than the lodge itself. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you're here. You're with me." His eyes fluttered open again, a hint of confusion still clouding his gaze, but it was quickly replaced by recognition. His hand, still cold but warming by the second, reached up to touch her face, brushing away the tears she hadn't even realized had fallen. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days, maybe longer. I thought I lost you." "No," Lucy said softly, shaking her head, her hand cupping his cheek. "You're here. We're both here. We made it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply lay there in the stillness of the cavern, wrapped in the warmth of the fire that burned inside them, the fire that had driven back the darkness. The shadows no longer reached for them, no longer twisted and coiled around their ankles. The weight of the lodge's hunger had lessened, though Lucy could still feel its presence, its grasp on the very ground beneath them. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't as powerful, as unyielding. They had done something that had made the darkness tremble. But even in this fragile peace, Lucy knew that peace was a fleeting thing. The hunger would return. It always did. She pushed herself to her knees, still holding Mark's hand, and glanced around the cavern. The walls, once alive with shadows and the pulse of the lodge, now seemed muted, drained of their energy. The firelight from their hands flickered against the stone, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but those shadows no longer felt alive. They were dying, receding, fading away into nothingness. The cavern felt emptier, quieter. It was as if the lodge itself had grown weaker, like a body drained of blood, too tired to fight anymore. But that didn't mean it was gone. Lucy's gaze shifted toward the farthest corner of the cavern, where the roots of the twisted trees still curled toward the ceiling like skeletal fingers. The dark, viscous sap that had once oozed from the walls had turned to stone, hardened into a grotesque mockery of life. And in the very center of the cavern, where the fire had first ignited, a large crack had formed in the stone floor. The earth seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural rhythm, as though the very foundation of the lodge was still alive, still breathing. But it was weakened. That much was certain. Lucy didn't know how long they had been trapped in this place. Days? Weeks? Months? Time had become fluid, stretching and contracting like the very shadows that had once chased them. But now, as she gazed into the cavern, a heavy sense of finality settled over her. She knew what she had to do. She had to leave. They had to leave. Mark stirred beside her, his hand tightening around hers. She glanced down at him, his tired eyes meeting hers with a question, one that seemed to say, "What now?" "We need to go," she said softly, her voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest. "The lodge isn't gone. Not completely. But we've beaten it back. And that's enough, for now." Mark's gaze followed hers, taking in the cavern, the remnants of the shadows, the hardened sap, the crack in the floor. He nodded slowly, his expression grim but resolute. He knew, just as she did, that they couldn't stay here. Not with the lodge still lingering, still waiting. Together, they pushed to their feet, swaying slightly as the ground beneath them groaned, as if protesting their departure. But Lucy wasn't listening to the cavern's protests. She wasn't listening to the soft whispers of the shadows that still tugged at her consciousness. She wasn't listening to the lodge. She was listening to Mark. She was listening to the fire inside her. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice firm. Mark took a breath and nodded, then squeezed her hand gently. They began to walk, side by side, across the cavern, toward the dark passage that would lead them out of the lodge. Every step felt like a small victory, a reaffirmation of their strength, their survival. The shadows did not follow them, did not reach for them. though Lucy could still feel the faint, gnawing presence of the hunger in the back of her mind, clawing at her thoughts. But she refused to let it take control again. The passage was narrow, winding, and the air grew heavier as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. The walls of the lodge seemed to close in on them, as if the place itself was trying to swallow them whole, trying to pull them back into its grasp. But Lucy kept moving forward. And Mark was right beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. The fire inside her flickered in time with each step, a reminder of what they had faced, what they had survived. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know how long it would take to escape the lodge's hold. But as long as Mark was by her side, as long as the fire burned within her, she knew she could keep fighting. There would be no giving up. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly, the passage widened, and they emerged into a vast chamber, unlike any they had seen before. The walls here were covered in strange, ancient symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie light that seemed to pulse and breathe in time with the fire that still burned in their chests. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but beneath that there was something else, something fresh, something alive. It was as though they had crossed into another world entirely. "This place," Mark murmured, his voice filled with awe and uncertainty. "I think it's the heart of the lodge," Lucy said, her voice barely a whisper. "The very core of it, where it all began." The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer as she spoke, their meaning lost in the swirling fog of the lodge's dark magic. The faint hum of energy filled the air, vibrating through Lucy's chest, resonating with the fire that burned inside her. She could feel it now, the pulse of the lodge itself, its power, its hunger. But it was weaker here, fragile, fading. And the fire inside Lucy, inside both of them, was stronger. Mark stepped closer to her, his hand finding hers once again. She squeezed it tightly, her grip strong, unwavering. She could feel the warmth of his touch, the warmth of the fire that now burned in them both. "Whatever this place is," he said, his voice low and steady, "we'll leave it behind. Together." Lucy nodded, her gaze fixed on the darkened doorway at the far end of the chamber. A path leading out, leading away from the lodge. But she knew, in the deepest part of her heart, that leaving didn't mean it was over. The lodge's hunger would always be there, a shadow lurking in the corners of the world. But they were stronger now. They had the fire. And that fire would carry them through. Together. Hand in hand, they walked toward the doorway, toward their future, leaving the lodge and the darkness behind. For now. But Lucy knew one thing deep in her bones. The hunger would come again. And when it did, she would be ready. They would both be ready. And they would fight. Together. The chamber behind them began to fade as they walked deeper into the dark corridor, the strange symbols on the walls dimming as they left them behind. The air grew heavier again, oppressive in a way that made Lucy's chest tighten, but this time it was different. There was no whispering shadow pulling at her mind, no hunger gnawing at her thoughts. There was only the steady, comforting presence of Mark by her side, and the unyielding fire that still burned bright within her. She could feel it, feel the shift in the very fabric of the lodge, as if its heart had been cut open and drained of the power it had once wielded. The hunger was still there, but it was distant now, faint, like the remnants of a dream fading away with the dawn. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had been driven back, broken at least for a time. For a time. But the thought didn't fill her with fear. It filled her with resolve. She had come so far, fought so hard, and she was not about to let that darkness consume them again. Not after everything they had faced. The fire inside her flickered and danced with each step they took, a steady pulse in her chest, like the heartbeat of the world itself. It had become part of her now, integrated, woven into the very marrow of her bones. It was the force that had pushed the lodge back, that had driven the shadows into retreat, and it was the force that would protect her, protect them both as they walked toward whatever future lay ahead. But that wasn't to say there was no fear. There was always fear. The path stretched out before them, the stone floor uneven beneath their feet, the walls closing in around them like the jaws of some great ancient beast. It felt as though the lodge itself were alive, still watching, still waiting, like an animal that had been wounded but was not yet dead. Every step they took felt like a gamble, a bet that the darkness wouldn't rise up and pull them back into its grip. Lucy glanced at Mark, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. But there was none. He walked beside her, his face set, his jaw clenched in quiet determination. His presence was a constant reminder that, no matter how heavy the weight of the world felt, they were in this together. "We'll make it out," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know we will." "I believe you," she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. They didn't speak again for a long while, the silence between them comfortable, filled only with the sound of their footsteps echoing down the winding corridors of the lodge. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, but there was something different about it now, something emptier. It was as if the lodge had lost its sense of purpose, as if the very air had grown hollow, drained of the malignant energy that had once pulsed through every crack in the stone. The walls of the passageway began to widen as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. The oppressive weight of the place, the crushing silence, gave way to a strange sense of stillness. It was almost as if the lodge was holding its breath, waiting for something. Lucy felt a flicker of unease, a sudden pang in her chest that made her stop in her tracks. She could sense something in the air, like a tremor, a shift. The fire inside her responded, flickering in warning, but she couldn't place it. She couldn't explain the feeling, only that it was a distant echo of something wrong. A vibration that hadn't yet resolved, a knot in the world that still needed to be unraveled. "Mark," she said softly, pulling him to a stop. "Do you feel that?" Mark looked at her, his brow furrowed, his expression unreadable. "Feel what?" Lucy hesitated. The sensation was fleeting, a barely perceptible hum, but it was there, sharp, insistent, like a whisper in the dark. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "It's like the lodge is still alive, but not like before. It feels like it's waiting." Mark's grip on her hand tightened. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know," she whispered, staring into the darkness ahead of them. "But I think we need to be careful." They continued forward, but the tension in the air grew thicker. Every step seemed to echo louder in the silence, and Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. She tried to push it from her mind, tried to focus on the fire burning within her, but the sensation clung to her like a shadow, refusing to let go. And then, just as they reached a narrow bend in the corridor, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from the walls. It wasn't loud, but it reverberated through the ground beneath their feet, a sound like the very earth itself was protesting their presence. The growl was low, primal, and full of malice, like the lodge had summoned something new, something that had lain dormant within the very foundation of the cavern. Lucy froze, her heart racing in her chest. She turned to Mark, her eyes wide with fear. What was that? Before he could answer, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and the walls around them shook as though the entire lodge was coming alive again. The darkness seemed to ripple, expanding outward in all directions, pressing against them like a living, breathing entity. And then, from the shadows ahead, something stepped forward. It was tall, towering, even, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The creature's form seemed to be made of shifting shadows, its body flickering in and out of existence like a ghost, yet its presence was undeniable. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, its eyes glowing with a deep, crimson light. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. It was the creature, the one they had thought was destroyed. But this wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as before. This thing was different. The creature's body flickered again, its limbs elongating, stretching unnaturally, like a shadow morphing into something more monstrous, something beyond comprehension. Its face was obscured, but Lucy could feel its gaze upon them, its eyes burning into her like a hot knife. The growl came again, louder this time, vibrating through her chest. "We need to run," Mark whispered, his voice tight with panic. But Lucy didn't move. She couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the creature before them, the thing that had once been part of the lodge's hunger. It was different now, more powerful, more tangible. It was an echo of the dark, something born from the very heart of the lodge, something that had been awakened by their actions. The creature moved closer, and with it, the darkness pressed tighter. The fire within Lucy flared, responding to the malevolent presence, but it wasn't enough. The shadows were stronger now, feeding off the creature's power, drawing from it like a lifeblood that gave them strength. Lucy could feel the fire inside her pushing against the darkness, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't strong enough to face what had been unleashed. And then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the fire surged again. This time, unbidden, uncontrollable, an overwhelming rush of heat and light that shot from her chest in all directions. The flames erupted outward, washing over the creature, enveloping it in a wave of searing heat. But the creature didn't scream. It didn't recoil. Instead, it absorbed the fire, the darkness feeding off the flames, twisting them, warping them into something new. The flames didn't burn away the creature. They fed it, made it stronger. Mark shouted, pulling her back, but the darkness was already closing in, pressing against them from all sides. The fire within Lucy was all she had left, and it was beginning to fade. But she wouldn't let it end like this. She couldn't. She focused on the fire, pulling on every last ounce of strength she had left. She could feel the energy surging through her, could feel the flames growing hotter, more intense. She let it build within her, gathering strength, forcing the fire to become something more, something beyond just warmth. She could feel the lodge's hunger reaching for her, trying to pull her into its grasp, but she refused to let it. "Mark," she shouted, her voice desperate, "we can do this. Together." Mark's hand gripped hers tighter, and he nodded, his expression hardening with determination. Together they were stronger than this. Together they could burn the darkness away. With one final, defiant cry, Lucy released the fire in a torrent of blinding light. The flames surged outward, consuming everything in their path, burning away the shadows, the hunger, the very darkness of the lodge itself. For a brief moment there was nothing but light, blinding, searing light. And then the darkness was gone. For now, the creature was no more. And Lucy and Mark were left standing in the aftermath, the fire still flickering softly within them, a reminder of the battle they had just fought. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they knew they were not alone. Together they would face whatever came next. But for now they had won, and they would survive.